Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into a world you can barely imagine. Around you stretches an open glacial plain wide as the sky dotted with tufts of green pushing stubbornly through the cold earth. And there, towering above the frosty grass, moving with surprising grace, is your co-star for the evening, the Irish Elk. Its antlers sweep skyward like giant living candelabras, casting long shadows in the pale moonlight. The air is crisp, your breath puffs, tiny clouds, and every tiny movement feels like it might disturb the ancient silence. Of course, you probably wouldn't survive this encounter. One wrong move and those giant antlers could accidentally swat you like a fly. Not on purpose, but when you're carrying 80 pounds of bone on your head, personal space is a tricky thing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where my fellow night owls are listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in quiet awe, taking in the full scale of the creature before you. Standing about 7 feet tall at the shoulder and even taller when you factor in those massive antlers, this majestic giant grazes calmly, as if entirely unaware of the evolutionary spectacle it represents. The early morning fog curls around its long legs like curious little snakes. Its coat is thick-suited for the fluctuating climates of the late Pleistocene, and its eyes gleam with a calm but watchful intelligence. The Irish elk, though neither strictly Irish nor technically an elk, has fascinated scientists, artists, and casual stargazers of extinction stories for centuries. Tonight, you're right in the middle of its world. The first thing you notice is, of course, those antlers. You can't not notice them. Spanning up to 12 feet from tip to tip, they're wider than most compact cars. You wonder briefly how this animal manages not to knock over every tree and bush it encounters. The sheer scale of those antlers is so absurd that when early naturalists dug up the fossils, some even speculated they were antlers of some mythical creature, perhaps proof that giants once roamed the earth. But no, this was very real. You're looking at a species that once wandered across vast stretches of Eurasia. Even though the name Irish elk sticks in modern tongues, that's a bit of taxonomic sloppiness. The name came about mostly because many of the first well-preserved skeletons were found in peat bogs across Ireland, their bones perfectly preserved in the waterlogged earth, like relics frozen in time. In reality, its proper scientific name is Megaloceros giganteus, which, if your Latin is rusty, essentially means giant great horned one. Bit on the nose perhaps, but it fits. And while it's often lumped in with modern elk, it's actually more closely related to deer. If you want to get picky, and let's face it, it belongs to the Cervidae family, which makes it something of an enormous deer, with extremely impractical headgear. You shift slightly in your imaginary snow boots, and the elk flicks an ear in your direction, acknowledging your presence but seemingly unconcerned. After all, to an animal that once ruled these open plains, you're just another minor curiosity, a modern visitor ghosting through its ancient story. The wind carries the distant sounds of other creatures, sharing this cold stage, shaggy mammoths, trundling along in search of grass, woolly rhinos, snorting as they scrape snow aside, and somewhere far away the haunting howl of an Ice Age wolf pack. The Irish elk stands here as both a monument to natural engineering and a riddle scientists have spent centuries trying to solve. One of those puzzles centers squarely on those ridiculous antlers. You glance up again, it's impossible not to and marvel at How nature could evolve such a burdensome ornament. Surely you think they must serve some grand purpose beyond simply looking impressive. Otherwise, why carry around nearly 100 pounds of bone like a permanent headache-inducing hat? Historians still argue whether these enormous antlers were primarily for mating displays like a peacock's tail, or whether they played some role in defense dominance or even species recognition. What we do know is that growing them required enormous amounts of energy and nutrients. Calcium, phosphorus, and other minerals had to be pulled from the elk's own skeleton and diet each year, just to grow these vast racks anew. And yes, they grew them every single year. Like all deer, Irish elk shed their antlers annually. The sheer biological strain of regenerating such monstrous structures boggles the mind. Imagine growing an entire dining room table on your head every spring, only to discard it after mating season and start again from scratch. You shift your gaze to the horizon, where the faint glimmer of a glacier winks beneath the rising sun. This Ice Age world, while brutal, was strangely suited to creatures like the Irish elk. Expansive grasslands provided the perfect buffet for these giant grazers. But as you'll soon discover, that balance would eventually shift. For now, though, you simply observe an enormous gentle giant, contentedly chewing its breakfast. The elk raises its head one last time, nostrils flaring as it samples the cold morning air. It senses the seasons turning as they always do. But for now, at this precise moment, it reigns supreme over this frosty kingdom. You can't help but feel a twinge of envy and perhaps a little pity for this magnificent animal, locked in nature's relentless tug-of-war between adaptation and excess. You're still walking carefully behind your towering companion, watching those massive antlers sway ever so slightly with each step. As the elk moves, you can't help but whisper to yourself, "Irish elk." But it's not Irish, and it's not really an elk. That's one of nature's great branding mistakes, honestly. The poor creature got saddled with a name that stuck for centuries even though it doesn't fit very well. If animals had marketing departments, this one should have definitely filed a complaint. Let's straighten things out while you stroll alongside it. The Irish part comes mostly from where many of the first, well-preserved skeletons were discovered deep within the peat bogs of Ireland. The cool, acidic, oxygen-poor bogs were like perfect little time capsules preserving bones and antlers for thousands of years. When 18th and 19th century naturalists dug these skeletons up, they naturally thought, "Aha, this must be an Irish species." But in truth, this magnificent beast roamed far beyond Ireland across great stretches of Europe, Russia, and even into Central Asia. And then there's the elk part. That's another bit of linguistic confusion that makes biologists wince. In Europe, elk refers to what Americans call moose, Alces alcis. In North America, elk refers to a totally different species, Cervus canadensis, more closely related to red deer. Neither of these categories really fits our antlered friend. Instead, your companion belongs to its own unique genus, Megaloceros. That name might not roll off the tongue at a dinner party, but it's much more accurate. Mega means giant. Ceros means horn, and my what horns they are. Technically, they're antlers, not horns, but we'll let the ancient Greeks slide on that one. So what is it really? The most accurate shorthand would be a gigantic extinct deer species, once among the largest that ever lived. At its peak, Megaloceros giganteus stood roughly 7 feet tall at the shoulder. That's NBA player height and weighed around 500 pounds. Basically, imagine a Volkswagen Beetle with legs. As you observe the animal munching on frosted grasses, You notice something else: the peculiar design of those antlers. Unlike modern deer, whose antlers usually curve backward or upward, the Irish elk's antlers splay out horizontally, like two enormous paddles, their flattened tines branching like skeletal fingers grasping at the sky. They aren't just wide, they're elegantly complicated, almost like natural sculptures. You suspect Michelangelo himself would have admired their geometry. Why did evolution give them such unusual antlers? Well, you're not the only one asking. Paleontologists still scratch their heads. Some argue that these broad, flat antlers help the stags show off to potential mates, a prehistoric version of flexing at the gym. The wider and more symmetrical the antlers, the more attractive the male likely appeared to females. This theory fits into what's known as sexual selection. When certain traits evolve because they appeal to mates, not necessarily because they help you survive, but others suggest different uses. Maybe the antlers acted as weapons during head-to-head clashes between males like living jousts. Or perhaps they served to intimidate rivals without actual fighting, the prehistoric equivalent of a "don't mess with me" sign. Historians still argue whether they primarily function for show or for battle. The debate remains unresolved, like many great mysteries of extinct creatures. You keep walking, stepping carefully as your boots crunch on patches of frozen earth. Around you, the landscape stretches out an endless Ice Age panorama. It's a world of wide open spaces ideal for these enormous creatures to thrive. But you also notice a line of trees off in the distance. And you quietly wonder, how did something carrying 12-foot wide antlers even get through a forest? That's another sticking point in the scientific debates. If forests grew too thick, these animals would have struggled to navigate through dense woodlands. Some researchers suggest that Irish elk populations flourished in open grasslands and lightly wooded areas, where their enormous antlers wouldn't snag on every passing branch. The very existence of those antlers may have limited where the species could comfortably live. Still, you marvel at how well this creature has adapted to its environment. It's a delicate balance, big enough to attract mates and deter rivals, but not so cumbersome as to prevent survival. Nature always walks that thin line between extravagance and practicality. The elk pauses and lifts its massive head toward the sky, sniffing the breeze. Maybe it's sensing the distant presence of predators. Or perhaps it's simply listening to the silent rhythm of its icy world, where every breath, every heartbeat echoes through the vast emptiness. You feel a chill yourself, not from fear but from awe. Your mind drifts, just for a moment, to the people who first discovered these ancient skeletons. The earliest known record of Irish elk fossils being studied dates back to the 1600s, when curious gentlemen in Europe stumbled upon these massive bones in bogs and gravel pits. Back then, they didn't quite grasp what they were looking at. Some thought the antlers came from biblical giants, fallen angels, or creatures from myth. Even into the 18th century, some scholars were still trying to squeeze these bones into biblical timelines. It wasn't until the rise of paleontology as a proper science in the 19th century that scientists began piecing together the true story of Megaloceros. And even today, each new fossil sparks fresh debates. Scholars still argue whether certain subspecies existed, whether the antler sizes vary dramatically across regions, and exactly why this magnificent creature finally vanished from Earth. You glance one last time at the elk beside you. Its breath steams gently in the cold, rising like wispy smoke. In this moment, it's easy to forget you're observing a species long gone. But the questions it leaves behind still rippled through modern science like footprints preserved in frozen mud. You continue walking at a respectful distance as your towering companion makes its way toward a frozen pond, glistening under the pale morning sun. It lowers its head, gracefully, careful, not to tip too far forward under the sheer weight of its outrageous headgear. Those antlers, my goodness, they're even more absurd up close. At their peak, the antlers of the largest males could span up to 12 feet. 12 feet. That's wider than most compact cars you see, zipping around in modern cities. And if you're wondering about weight around 80 to 90 pounds per pair, that's like carrying an entire, full-grown golden retriever on your head at all times. Except the dog doesn't wiggle or bark, it just sits there, perfectly balanced, all bone, and no forgiveness. Your own neck starts to ache just imagining the constant strain. The elk, however, seems entirely unbothered. It dips its head delicately, lapping up a bit of icy water. A small group of woolly rhinos trudges past in the distance, their thick bodies swaying like slow-moving mountains under shaggy blankets. The Irish elk pays them little mind. For now, the world feels safe. But that brings you back to a question that's puzzled scientists for generations. Why so big? Why would evolution encourage such ridiculous antler size? One popular theory, which you'll hear a lot, is that it's mostly the fault of the females. Not directly, of course, but through sexual selection, females may have favored males with larger, more symmetrical antlers. Over thousands of generations, this preference pushed the males into what you might call an antler arms race. If your rival had wide antlers, you needed wider ones. And so it escalated like an evolutionary auction, where no one wanted to be the first to blink. It's not unlike modern humans competing over who has the flashiest car or the biggest house. At some point, practicality falls by the wayside, and it's all about impressing your peers, or in this case, your potential mates. Still, not everyone agrees. Some paleontologists argue that the antlers weren't purely for mating displays. They may have been used for sparring actual physical contests between rival males. Imagine two of these behemoths squaring off heads, lowered antlers locked together in a slow-motion wrestling match, each trying to push the other off balance. The winner would gain mating privileges. The loser would wander off to nurse a bruised ego, and perhaps a bruised everything else. Historians still argue whether these antlers were primarily ornaments, weapons, or both. What complicates matters further is the sheer diversity found in fossil records. Some males had slightly smaller antlers, others had variations in tine patterns, suggesting that regional conditions and genetic quirks might have played significant roles. As you ponder this, the elk raises its head again. Its neck muscles ripple beneath thick fur. Those muscles are surprisingly robust, especially adapted to handle the enormous headgear. You imagine how every year these antlers would grow back even larger than the year before, fueled by the richness of the surrounding grasslands and mineral-rich vegetation. Growing them was no small task. The process began shortly after shedding the old antlers at the end of winter. By spring, fresh antlers would begin sprouting, covered in a soft fuzzy layer called velvet, rich with blood vessels feeding nutrients to the rapidly expanding bone. During peak growth, the antlers could grow as much as half an inch per day. That's right, daily. Think of it like watching scaffolding chewed up around a building overnight, except it's growing out of your forehead. Once fully grown, the velvet would dry and peel away, revealing the hardened bone beneath. Then came the season of competition. The bigger the antlers, the better your odds. Or at least that was the hope. You step around a small patch of icy shrubs and almost stumble over a familiar sight, a discarded antler, lying partially buried in the snow. It's massive even by your newly adjusted standards. The base, where it once connected to the skull, is thick and round, resembling a tree stump, more than a bone. You brush off some of the snow, running your gloved hand along the tines, marveling at the intricate ridges. Each curve tells a story of nutrition, health, and status from the elk's previous year. Finding an antler like this would have thrilled early human hunters and collectors. In fact, long after the Irish elk vanished, humans would stumble upon these relics and haul them back to settlements as trophies or mysterious artifacts. Some were even mounted on walls or displayed in the great halls of European castles centuries later. The elk beside you snorts softly and moves on its breath, puffing into the frosty air like miniature clouds. You can't help but wonder, did the sheer size of these antlers eventually become too much? Did natural selection push the species to an unsustainable extreme? That question haunts scientists to this day. The balance between sexual selection and practical survival is delicate. If the antlers got too big, the animals might struggle to move efficiently, navigate dense forests, or escape predators. But if the antlers weren't impressive enough, they risked losing out on mating opportunities. Evolution walks a dangerous tightrope. In fact, some researchers believe we may be witnessing similar phenomena in certain modern animals. Think of peacocks with their ridiculously oversized tail feathers, or certain songbirds whose elaborate mating calls seem to defy energy efficiency. The Irish elk may simply represent one of nature's most extravagant experiments in showmanship, one that unfortunately may have pushed the limits too far. Your companion continues forward, antlers swaying rhythmically as though oblivious to the evolutionary debate, swirling around its very existence. But you're starting to realize just how razor-thin the line was between survival and collapse. For this magnificent creature, the elk strides onward, its colossal antlers slicing through the morning mist like the wings of some antlered angel. You watch closely, still wrestling with the question that has plagued scientists for decades. Could those absurd antlers really have been built just for showing off? The more you walk, the more you're convinced they weren't entirely practical. I mean, let's be honest, you wouldn't design an animal for pure survival and hand it a 12-foot wide hat. Evolution doesn't usually specialize in convenience, but it does specialize in trade-offs. And so, you arrive at one of the most popular modern theories: sexual selection gone wild. Unlike natural selection, where traits help an organism survive, predators, climates, or disease, sexual selection is that much messier cousin. It's driven by reproductive advantage. You don't necessarily need to live long. You just need to pass on your genes before you check out. And if growing larger antlers helps you charm a few more mates, or intimidate rivals into stepping aside, well, your genes win. You watch as your Irish elk companion slows its pace, glancing toward a small herd grazing nearby. Among them are several females, smaller, sleeker, unburdened by oversized headgear. The males, though, seem hyper-aware of each other's presence, stealing quick glances, adjusting posture like teenagers at a high school dance, sizing each other up from opposite sides of the gym. One younger male approaches his antlers, impressive but not yet fully mature. Your giant companion takes notice. The two circle each other cautiously, heads slightly lowered, muscles coiled in readiness. It's not yet full combat, more like a silent negotiation. Here's where those enormous antlers become less about function and more about messaging. You don't have to fight if your opponent decides you're already clearly superior. And when your antlers stretch an additional 2 feet past his, that message comes through loud and clear. Scientists studying modern deer species like red deer or moose have observed similar behaviors. Often, fights are avoided altogether through posturing and display. The bigger the antlers, the greater the intimidation factor. The less likely it escalates into full-blown antler shoving. Essentially, bigger antlers mean you can win without fighting. Like flashing your Olympic gold medal before anyone even steps into the ring. But when fights do happen, that's where things get dramatic. You watch as, after a few tense moments, the younger male concedes, backing away respectfully. No battle today. Your companion lifts his head victorious without ever having touched the newcomer. His antlers glint in the weak sunlight, a silent billboard advertising his dominance to both rivals and nearby females. And here's where the real evolutionary balancing act kicks in. The bigger the antlers, the higher the odds of reproductive success, but also the bigger the risk that you've handicapped yourself in nearly every other department. Running from predators harder, maneuvering through trees trickier, holding your head up all day exhausting. Historians still argue whether Irish elk males were truly at the brink of evolutionary collapse because of these antlers. Some researchers suggest that over time antler size grew so extreme that it became unsustainable. Others argue that environmental factors changing habitats, climate shifts, and human pressures played a much larger role, and that the antlers themselves weren't necessarily the fatal flaw. You pause for a moment watching the small herd graze. It's oddly peaceful here. The wind rustles dry grasses. The distant call of a prehistoric bird echoes faintly. Yet you can't shake the feeling that you're standing at the center of one of evolution's grand experiments, one whose outcome remains both magnificent and tragic. Interestingly, similar patterns crop up across the animal kingdom. Take, for example, the narwhal. Its famous tusk, which is actually a spiral tooth, can reach up to 10 feet long. Biologists believe it plays a similar role in sexual selection and dominance, though its exact function remains partly mysterious. Or consider the bowerbird, which doesn't grow elaborate physical features but instead constructs intricate decorated nests to woo potential mates. The Irish elk just happened to take its particular version of this evolutionary gamble to architectural extremes. As you continue walking, you realize something else growing. Those antlers wasn't just a vanity project. It came at a steep physiological price. Studies of fossilized Irish elk bones suggest that the calcium required to build those antlers each year placed enormous strain on the animal's internal reserves. Some researchers even speculate that these stacks cannibalize their own skeletal stores of calcium to fuel antler growth, leaving their bones more brittle and vulnerable as they aged. Imagine that, sacrificing your own bone density to grow ever bigger antlers, all for a few weeks of increased mating odds. The price of admission to the genetic lottery was brutally high, and yet, for tens of thousands of years, it worked. The Irish elk thrived across enormous territories, its gene pool strong and vibrant. Evolution may be wasteful, but it's also remarkably effective until the world shifts out from under you. The wind picks up again, colder now, as though hinting at the challenges still to come. For now, though, the antlers stand tall, defiant against both rivals and the coming storms of history. You follow your Irish elk companion a little farther now into terrain that grows increasingly uneven. The open grasslands start giving way to denser patches of woodland young trees, and thickets scattered like poorly planned furniture across a narrowing living room. And here, the true cost of those enormous antlers becomes painfully obvious. You watch as the elk moves carefully, threading its giant headgear through gaps in the trees. Each twist of the neck seems deliberate, like a truck driver negotiating a narrow alley. One wrong turn and the sprawling tines could easily snag on low branches or young saplings, bringing the entire animal to a frustrating halt. You almost hold your breath as one particularly wide turn threatens disaster, but the elk ducks its head at just the right moment, slipping past the obstacle. With the grace of something that's had to practice this routine its entire life. This is where things get interesting and where many paleontologists begin raising their eyebrows. If the world were nothing but open grasslands forever, these massive antlers might have worked fine. But ecosystems are never that cooperative. As the climate shifted near the end of the Pleistocene, forests began expanding. Open plains shrank. And for an animal carrying a 12-foot wide bony chandelier on its head, dense woodland is basically a permanent obstacle course. Historians still argue whether this expanding forestation was one of the leading contributors to the Irish elk's eventual downfall. Some scientists believe the encroaching woods may have fragmented their habitat, limiting access to food mates and safe migration routes. Others suggest that the species simply couldn't adapt fast enough to the narrowing, thickening corridors. And there's no denying that antlers of this size are, to put it gently, less than ideal for tight spaces. You watch as the elk pauses again, carefully picking its path between clustered birch trees, its antlers casting strange, skeletal shadows in the dappled morning light. The forest almost seems to close in behind it, as if nature herself is slowly, methodically reshaping the battlefield. The elk stops to graze again on a patch of winter grass. You notice how much bending, turning, and craning is required just to lower its head without bashing its antlers into the undergrowth. Even simple tasks like feeding require a surprising amount of finesse. This is not a creature designed for multitasking. Eating while watching for predators, while keeping your antlers out of the bushes, that's a full-time job in itself. You start to appreciate just how tightly evolution had boxed these creatures into their niche. So much of their success relied on living in wide-open habitats where their headgear could be displayed in full magnificent glory, without bumping into every tree and bush along the way. In open tundra and steppe environments, those antlers likely shone as a huge evolutionary advantage, broadcasting strength, intimidating rivals, and attracting mates across flat open visibility. But once trees began muscling in, it was a different story. You step aside as your elk companion turns again, navigating yet another thicket. Watching this feels a bit like watching a person trying to walk through a crowded antique shop while wearing a pair of giant airplane wings. Graceful, yes, but only because it's had a lifetime to practice. Natural, not so much. This is where some modern scientists have drawn fascinating parallels with other megafauna from the Ice Age. Many large animals, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, thrived when their specialized habitats were plentiful. But as climates warmed, ecosystems shifted. Forests spread, grasslands receded, and many of these giants found themselves living in shrinking pockets of suitable habitat. The Irish elk, for all its grandeur, was no exception. Its magnificent antlers may have dazzled mates and rival males alike, but they became a logistical nightmare in increasingly cluttered forests. Some fringe researchers have even suggested that the antler size was starting to reduce slightly toward the end of the species' reign, that perhaps natural selection was trying to course correct as the forest thickened. But this idea remains hotly debated. The fossil record offers only scattered hints, not solid conclusions. You pause beside a fallen tree. Its trunk split where some ancient force, wind ice, or the weight of snow brought it down. The elk continues forward, carefully stepping over twisted roots and ducking under drooping branches. You realize not for the first time that evolution isn't always kind. It builds marbles, but sometimes those marbles come with built-in expiration dates. And yet, despite all these challenges, the Irish elk managed to persist for tens of thousands of years. For most of its reign, these obstacles were manageable. It wasn't until climate change, habitat shifts, and a few more complicated variables began piling up together that things really started tipping the balance. Ahead of you, the trees, thin again for a moment, opening into another grassy glade. The elk lifts its head, stepping into the clearing with visible relief, antlers stretching proudly toward the morning sky once more, like a king emerging from a too small hallway, back into his sprawling throne room. You exhale softly, realizing that for this animal, every day was a delicate balancing act between majesty and mobility. As your elk companion settles into the open glade, something else becomes clear, something that might hold the key to why those antlers reached such absurd proportions in the first place. You see, for all the debates over climate, habitat, and antler logistics, one simple truth hovers over everything. The females had a say in this. You glance toward a small group of female Irish elk gathered nearby. Compared to the males, they're smaller, sleeker, and refreshingly unencumbered by oversized headgear. Their heads move gracefully as they graze, completely free of the awkward balancing act the males endure. But don't let that simplicity fool you. These females were the engine driving the entire antler escalation. In most species where males develop extravagant features, whether it's the peacock's ridiculous tail, the elephant seal's blubbery nose, or the bighorn sheep's oversized horns, the driving force is often female choice. The Irish elk was no exception. The prevailing theory is that females consistently chose mates with larger, more symmetrical antlers, seeing them as signs of strong genetics, health, and vitality. Over thousands of generations, this preference nudged males toward ever larger antler sizes. You watch as one female pauses to glance up at your towering male companion. She gives him a long, slow look, perhaps evaluating the width of his antlers, the symmetry of the tines, the shine of the bone in the early sun. In the language of evolutionary biology, this is assessment. She may not be conscious of it, but her instincts are weighing his fitness as a mate. Of course, not every male could pull off such grandeur. Growing these antlers demanded enormous amounts of nutrition and minerals. Only the strongest, healthiest individuals, with access to rich grazing lands and plentiful calcium, could manage it. That made antler size a reliable indicator of genetic fitness. In a world full of predators, disease, and harsh winters, females likely gravitated toward males who could grow and survive carrying such absurd decorations. Scientists call this principle the handicap hypothesis. The idea is simple if somewhat counterintuitive. Extravagant, costly features actually advertise an animal's strength, because only the strongest individuals can afford to produce them. In a sense, your elk companion's giant antlers are like a neon sign flashing. Look how awesome I am, I can survive even with all this baggage. But of course, there's always debate. Historians still argue whether female choice was the main driver or whether male-to-male competition played a bigger role. Were females mostly choosing partners based on antler size, or were they simply selecting the winners of antler-clashing battles between males, or was it some messy combination of both? As you watch the herd interact, you start to see how complex this ancient social system must have been. A mixture of displays, tests of strength, careful observations, all orchestrated around reproduction. Evolution isn't some cold, logical process. It's often wasteful, inefficient, and weirdly beautiful. One young male nearby, clearly not yet fully grown, approaches a small cluster of females. His antlers are modest, maybe 5 or 6 feet across. He strikes a cautious pose, head high, chest out, as if to say, "Hey ladies, check me out." But compared to your older, fully mature companion, the youngster looks like a teenager borrowing his dad's jacket, trying but not quite there yet. The females glance at him briefly, then turn back to grazing. No drama, no rejection, just nature quietly sorting out who makes the cut this season. You can't help but smile a little. Even in the Pleistocene, the dating scene was brutal. Nearby, a small skirmish between 2 other males catches your attention. No full-on combat, more like a slow circling dance, each lowering their antlers, slightly testing their angles, sizing each other up. It's clear that these contests weren't always about physical harm. Often it was about intimidation posture and reading the room. You realize that growing enormous antlers wasn't just about brute strength, it was about communication. A well-displayed rack told rivals whether it was even worth challenging you. Most disputes likely ended before they began, with one male backing down to avoid injury. It's easy to think of evolution as brutal, but in many cases the stakes were simply too high for constant combat. A serious injury could mean death in a world full of predators and harsh winters. Intimidation, rather than violence, was often the wiser course. And here's another fascinating layer. Recent studies of modern deer suggest that symmetry in antlers plays a huge role in both attracting mates and intimidating rivals. Slight asymmetries, crooked tines, uneven spreads may signal past injuries, poor nutrition, or genetic weakness. The more balanced and perfect the antlers, the stronger the genetic message they send. You glance again at your towering companion. His antlers are nearly flawless, broad, evenly spread every tine, branching in harmony. In evolutionary terms, he is a walking advertisement for peak Irish Elk genetics. No wonder the females keep sneaking glances his way. The wind stirs again, carrying the scent of distant snow as clouds gather along the horizon. For now though, the herd grazes peacefully, locked in their timeless rituals of display choice and silent negotiation, all orchestrated by the invisible hand of evolution. You exhale softly. The world of the Irish elk is starting to feel both alien and oddly familiar, like echoes of our own messy, competitive search for love and survival. The clouds thicken above as your journey continues. The light dims a little, giving the world a cooler, softer glow, but the elk herd seems unfazed. They've been through harsher seasons. And as you walk among them, you begin to fully grasp just how deep these antler arms ran. You watch 2 young males stand side by side, grazing peacefully for now. But even from here, you can see it, their antlers, while smaller than your dominant companions, are already locked in competition. One rack spreads wider, but the other boasts slightly thicker beams. The differences might seem minor to you, but in evolutionary terms, they're monumental. This, right here, is the arms race. over generations as females preferred the males with bigger antlers, and as rivals differed. To the most impressive displays, the pressure to grow wider, heavier, more extravagant antlers only intensified. Every successful male passed along genes that nudged the next generation's antlers a little larger, a little bolder, and so, like a prehistoric version of an ever-escalating auction, the antlers grew. Each generation raised the stakes just a bit more. You can almost hear the whispered bids echoing through the ages. 12 feet. Do I hear 12 and a half? But as always with arms races, whether it's nature or human history, escalation carries consequences. The farther you go, the more precarious the balance becomes. You see, antlers aren't free. They demand resources and lots of them. At the peak of antler growth, your towering companion was likely consuming enormous amounts of minerals daily. Calcium, phosphorus, and protein had to flood his system to build and sustain such elaborate bone structures. His body wasn't just growing antlers, it was cannibalizing internal reserves, tapping into bones, organs, and even risking long-term health just to compete in the annual breeding game. It's almost comical in its self-destructive beauty, like an athlete training so hard for gold that they risk permanent damage in the process. Some paleontologists speculate that toward the end of the species' reign, the antlers may have reached a kind of absurdity point where further growth offered diminishing returns, but continued anyway because the evolutionary pressure never eased. Even as forests closed in and resources grew patchier, the antler race pushed forward. Historians still argue whether this runaway selection helped push the Irish elk toward extinction. Some say yes, that the species painted itself into a biological corner it couldn't escape. Others counter that habitat loss, climate swings, and human pressures mattered far more than the antlers alone. Likely, it was a fatal cocktail of all these forces conspiring together. You step aside as your antlered companion begins a slow walk toward a mineral lick, a patch of exposed earth rich in essential nutrients. He lowers his head and gently scrapes the ground, licking up the calcium his body so desperately craves. It's a humble moment, yet deeply revealing. These mineral licks were critical lifelines, scattered across their vast range, providing the building blocks for their massive antlers each season. You imagine entire herds gathering at these spots, quietly jockeying for space. Each animal instinctively driven to stockpile the nutrients necessary for the next antler growth marathon. The ground beneath your feet is dotted with grooves and old scrape marks, silent evidence of generations performing this same ritual. And while you stand there, a thought crosses your mind. Nature is filled with arms races like this. Consider modern examples. The fiddler crab's oversized claw, used in mating displays and rival intimidation, grows so large in some individuals that it becomes almost useless for anything else. Yet the race continues. Or look at songbirds, whose increasingly elaborate calls and songs seem designed more to outcompete rivals than for any true survival advantage. The Irish elk may be one of evolution's most extravagant cautionary tales. The difference here is scale. No other land mammal, not before or since, has carried antlers quite like these. They represent one of nature's most extreme experiments in beauty power and dangerous overindulgence. The wind shifts again and you spot something glimmering in a nearby patch of snow, an ancient antler fragment bleached pale by time, partially buried like a secret. You crouch down and brush away the snow carefully. Its edges are jagged, but you can still trace the elegant curve of a tiny fossilized whisper of the arms race that once played out right here. The herd moves on your giant companion trailing slightly behind, now head swaying gently, as though tired from the day's exertions. You feel the weight of those antlers just by watching him, like carrying an entire tree branch for months at a time, knowing full well you'll have to repeat the ordeal next year. And yet, despite everything, you can't deny the majesty of it. Evolution may be reckless, even cruel at times, but it creates undeniable beauty. As absurd as those antlers are, they're also breathtaking frozen echoes of a time when nature wasn't afraid to take wild risks. The snow begins to fall softly now, dusting the landscape with fresh powder. The elk presses forward, head high, antlers wide, a walking monument to both triumph and tragedy. The snowfall thickens around you, muffling the world into a soft hush as your companion continues its steady march. Each step leaves deep, rounded impressions in the fresh powder. The great elk, moving with that odd mixture of grace and caution that seems built into its design. And as you walk behind, you start to appreciate something that most people don't realize: just how expensive it was, biologically speaking, to maintain those monstrous antlers. You've already seen glimpses of the mineral leaks where Irish elk gathered to scrape precious calcium from the earth. But that was only one small piece of the enormous biological budget required to build these oversized headpieces. Every spring, as winter loosened its icy grip, males would begin to sprout fresh antlers. The process wasn't casual. It was more like a full-blown physiological construction project. You imagine the elk's body hard at work beneath the fur blood vessels, pumping nutrients like frantic couriers, delivering supplies to a remote outpost. The growing antlers, covered in velvet at this stage, were among the fastest growing tissues in the entire animal kingdom. At peak growth, they could expand nearly half an inch per day, every day. That's like waking up and discovering your head has sprouted another sizable chunk of architecture overnight. And all of it, every cell, every fiber, demanded a steady, enormous drain of nutrients. The real kicker: much of that calcium didn't just come from the animal's diet. It came, disturbingly enough, from its own skeleton. Scientists studying fossilized Irish elk bones have found evidence that their legs, ribs, and spines may have been systematically depleted of minerals during antler growth, essentially cannibalizing internal reserves to keep the growth engine running. It's as if the elk's body operated like a desperate builder short on materials, ripping floorboards from one part of the house just to keep adding extra wings on the roof. The cost was staggering: weaker bones, more brittle frames, and likely increased vulnerability as the animals aged. Historians still argue whether this biological drain significantly shortened the lifespans of male Irish elk. Some believe that repeated cycles of antler growth left older males increasingly fragile, more prone to fractures and injuries as they entered their twilight years. Others suggest the species managed to balance the cost more efficiently than we assume. But the evidence remains tantalizingly incomplete. You watch your massive companion pause again, lowering his head into a shallow drift of snow, using his broad muzzle to brush away the powder, in search of hidden grasses beneath. Even this simple act seems weighted with effort. Balancing 80 pounds of bone above your skull turns basic movement into an engineering challenge. And all for what? For a chance, not a guarantee, at reproduction. The Irish elk's evolutionary path reads like a gambling story, risking everything for a brief window of dominance during the mating season. For the few that won, their genes were passed on to the next generation. For those that didn't, well, nature doesn't offer consolation prizes. You continue following as he resumes walking. The herd's females keep a polite distance grazing and occasionally glancing toward the males as if calculating future choices. This, you realize, is why the stakes stayed so high for so long. So long as females kept favoring the largest antlered males, natural selection kept raising the bar. And because those traits were so directly tied to reproductive success, there was no easy off-ramp. Each generation inherited both the glory and the burden. In a strange way, it almost mirrors modern human behavior. We chase bigger, better, flashier markers of success, wealth, possession, status, even when the returns grow questionable. The Irish Elk's oversized antlers feel like nature's quiet commentary on our own evolutionary quirks. You walk a little closer, hearing the faint clatter of antlers brushing together as two young males practice gentle sparring nearby. Their movements are surprisingly careful, almost rehearsed. They're learning the rituals they'll need when their turn comes. These practice bouts serve both as training and as a kind of social calibration, a way to test strength without risking serious injury. Even here, you see how costly full combat would be. A serious antler fracture could mean disaster not only for that year's mating season, but potentially for survival through the winter. Everything about the Irish Elk's world was built on razor-thin margins. Just enough food, just enough minerals, just enough strength to carry forward. And yet, for tens of thousands of years they managed it. Despite the enormous demands, the species flourished across vast stretches of Ice Age Eurasia, from Ireland through Siberia. Their success wasn't a fluke. It was the result of complex balances struck over millennia. The snowfall eases for a moment, and you catch a glimpse of distant movement shadows slipping between the trees. Predators? Likely a pack of Ice Age wolves, keeping their distance for now but always calculating. For a healthy adult male, Irish elk, the antlers served little direct defensive purpose. But their size might have offered at least some deterrence, an intimidating spectacle that suggested too much effort for too little reward. Still, if age or injury weakened a male, predators would be waiting. And with bones possibly weakened from years of antler production, older males may have faced growing risks as their bodies wore down. You exhale, watching your breath swirl in the crisp air. The more you observe, the more you realize how tightly wound this entire species was. An evolutionary marvel, teetering on a perpetual brink. Ahead, your companion pauses on a ridge, framed against the pale winter sky. His antlers cut bold shapes against the clouds, still as breathtaking and as impractical as ever. The air grows colder as you continue your quiet pursuit, your boots crunching softly in the shallow snow behind your antlered guide. With every step deeper into this ancient world, you begin to wonder how exactly does this massive creature fit into the family tree of deer, elk, and moose. Because let's be honest, at first glance, it looks like some kind of Frankenstein hybrid. To untangle this mystery, we'll need to wade into a bit of evolutionary housekeeping. First, a simple truth despite the misleading name. The Irish elk was not in fact an elk, at least not in the way modern biologists use the word. Nor was it especially Irish, as you've already discovered. Instead, it belongs to a fascinating branch of the Cervidae family, the vast, diverse family of deer. You glance again at your companion with his giant antlers and massive frame. Standing nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing more than 1 to 500 pounds, he towers over most modern deer species. And yet, surprisingly, his closest living relatives aren't elk, Cervus canadensis, or moose, Alces alces. but rather fall somewhere closer to modern fallow deer, dama, the smaller elegant spotted deer found today in woodlands and parklands across parts of Europe. Yes, you heard that right. The majestic Irish elk is more like a fallow deer, scaled up into some absurd Ice Age fantasy version of itself. Scientists have placed the Irish elk in its own genus, Megaloceros, meaning literally giant horn. That feels pretty on brand. Within Megaloceros, there were a few other species with varying sizes and antler shapes, but none achieved the truly ridiculous proportions of Megaloceros giganteus, the superstar you're following now. You watch as your giant companion lowers his head again, digging through the snow for hidden grasses, and you can't help but mentally line up his extended family. Over there in evolutionary time, you'd find white-tailed deer, red deer, reindeer, even muntjacs, that odd little deer with tiny tusks, wandering around Asian forests. All are part of the same global deer family reunion. In contrast, moose with their broad palmate antlers represent a different evolutionary offshoot entirely, though people often confuse the two. The superficial similarity of their flattened antler shapes has led many a confused amateur to mistakenly lump Irish elk closer to moose than they really belong. Historians still argue whether the antler shape of the Irish elk represents true convergent evolution, meaning different species arriving at similar traits independently, or if it reflects some deeper shared ancestral trait long lost among other deer lines. The answer remains fuzzy, and every new fossil seems to spark fresh debates at paleontology conferences. You notice something else too as you observe the shape of your elk's antlers from behind. Unlike moose, whose antlers curve broadly out and then upward like enormous fans, the Irish elk's antlers project almost entirely sideways, like vast horizontal wings. That design, while making forest navigation a nightmare, may have maximized their visual presence on open plains, where long-distance visibility mattered most during mating season. As you ponder all this, your thoughts shift toward another question. Paleontologists often wrestle with: why didn't more deer species evolve antlers this size? After all, if bigger antlers were such an advantage, why don't we see modern red deer or elk walking around with 12-foot racks? The answer likely lies in the razor's edge trade-offs you've already witnessed. Irish elk may have lived during a uniquely generous moment in Earth's history, the late Pleistocene, when vast grasslands stretched across Eurasia, providing rich feeding grounds capable of supporting such energy-hungry anatomy. Modern habitats simply can't sustain that kind of excessive hardware. You glance across the landscape, now endless tundra. Grasses wave in the wind untouched by modern agriculture, free of highways or cities. Back then, entire continents offered the perfect conditions for giant grazers to thrive. But as environments shifted, so too did the opportunities for such extravagant traits. And while modern deer still sport impressive antlers, they've largely settled into more sustainable designs, impressive enough to attract mates, but not so large as to tip the balance towards self-destruction. You step carefully as your path winds alongside a frozen stream, watching your elk's heavy hoofs crunch through thin sheets of ice. The herd ahead continues grazing smaller females, younger males with growing racks, all quietly participating in the same ancient cycle that shaped their ancestors' massive antlers. Every time you observe one of these evolutionary giants, you're struck again by how precarious their situation truly was. In the world of Ice Age, megafauna specialization could bring great success, but it could also lead to disaster when conditions changed even slightly. The wind picks up again, carrying with it the faint scent of distant mammoths, another Ice Age titan, marching through history alongside your companion. Like the Irish Elk mammoths too were highly specialized and highly vulnerable to environmental shifts. You pull your cloak tighter as snow flurries swirl, knowing that the next part of this journey will dive even deeper into the vast, frozen territories that these giants once ruled. For now though, your antlered guide presses forward oblivious to the debates he still inspires tens of thousands of years later. The terrain begins to shift under your feet. The open plains you've grown used to now ripple into frozen lowlands, dotted with icy puddles and patches of frostbitten moss. Your elk companion trudges forward without hesitation, perfectly at home in this harsh landscape. This, after all, was the kingdom of the Irish elk, vast and varied, stretching far beyond the Irish bogs that preserved its bones. We tend to think of this magnificent creature as a strictly European resident, but that's only a small part of the story. In truth, the Irish elk reigned far and wide, from the Atlantic shores of Ireland all the way across Eurasia into Siberia, and even parts of Central Asia. The full territory they occupied would put many modern species to shame. As you walk, you imagine the scale of it all. Herds roaming through the cold steppes of Russia, grazing across what is now Kazakhstan, wandering the foothills of the Ural Mountains. In these enormous sweeping habitats, food was abundant enough for a time to sustain even creatures carrying 80 pounds of antler bone. You cross a small frozen stream, now carefully stepping across slippery rocks. Your companion handles the terrain much better. His splayed hoofs give him excellent footing on snow and ice, a built-in adaptation that allowed him to navigate these slippery, unpredictable landscapes. Scientists studying the remains of Irish elk from different regions have noted slight variations between populations. Those in Siberia, for example, may have been slightly larger in body mass than their European cousins, a possible response to the even colder climates of the far north. In some cases, fossilized remains have been found at astonishingly high latitudes, suggesting that these animals were far hardier than many once believed. And yet, even here in these icy strongholds, they were never entirely alone. You sense it as you glance toward the tree line, the ever-present pressure of predators. Ice Age wolves, packs of cave lions, perhaps even the occasional saber-toothed cat, lurking in the shadows, watching for any hint of weakness in the herd. Historians still argue whether predator pressure significantly shaped the evolution of the Irish elk's size and antlers. Some suggest that large body mass made them less attractive targets for smaller predators, while others believe their antlers offered some limited intimidation, though they weren't exactly designed for fending off an ambush from behind. The truth likely lies somewhere in the gray middle ground as usual. But predators weren't the only threat lurking out here. You spot something on the horizon, now faint but unmistakable. Smoke. Not from wildfires, but from campfires. Humans. By the time early Homo sapiens expanded across Ice Age, Eurasia, Irish elk were already well-established residents, and humans, ever the opportunistic hunters, quickly recognized these giant deer as walking feasts. One adult Irish elk could easily feed an entire band of people for weeks, not to mention the antlers themselves, which were sometimes harvested for tools, ornaments, or even early attempts at artistic expression. You imagine the scene. Small groups of prehistoric hunters carefully tracking these massive creatures across the snow, setting ambushes near watering holes or migration routes. Spears, poised bodies shivering in the cold, hoping for a clean kill and aware that one poorly thrown weapon could turn them from hunters into the hunted. Still, for all the risks, humans persisted. They were clever, adaptable, and relentless. As population expanded, human pressure on megafauna increased not just through hunting but also by reshaping landscapes, burning grasslands, to encourage fresh growth for game or inadvertently disturbing migration patterns. Your elk companion snorts softly, perhaps sensing something distant that you cannot. His instincts are honed for survival in a dangerous world. But even so, there was no defense against the slow, creeping expansion of human across these frozen continents. Some researchers argue that habitat fragmentation, partially driven by both climate shifts and human activity, may have played a larger role in the Irish elk's decline than direct hunting alone. As open grasslands shrank and forests advanced, the broad corridors once used for seasonal migrations began to fracture. Isolated herds struggled to maintain genetic diversity, and food supplies became less predictable. The world these giants once ruled was changing beneath their hooves. And yet, for now, your elk companion presses on, navigating this cold open expanse with steady determination. Around you, the haunting calls of distant birds echo across the ice fields, perhaps ancient cranes or wild geese, migrating ahead of the coming winter storms. You pull your cloak tighter as the wind cuts sharper now, sweeping down from the distant mountains. Even bundled in layers, you feel the bite of the cold, a tiny taste of the conditions these creatures endured season after season. But your companion, he barely flinches. This world was built for him, at least for a while. As you trudge on behind him, you realize that the Irish elk's story is not one of immediate catastrophe, but of slow, grinding change, environmental pressures, layering one upon another like falling snow until even giants find themselves outmatched. The horizon fades into pale white now, as though the earth and sky are blurring together in the endless cold. Still, the elk moves forward, antlers cutting bold shapes against the fading light, a lone ambassador of a vanished world that once stretched from Ireland to the far edge of Asia. The wind hisses softly through brittle grasses as your companion leads you onward deeper into the frozen wilderness. Here, in this open expanse, you begin to appreciate another challenge. The Irish elk faced not one of antlers or predators or even humans, but something far more elemental. The Ice Age chill. At first glance, it almost seems like a mismatch. This massive short-necked creature doesn't exactly scream cold weather specialist, unlike woolly mammoths or musk oxen, whose stocky builds, shaggy coats, and small extremities scream Arctic survival. The Irish elk presents a curious hybrid of adaptations. You observe your companion closely now. His fur is certainly thick, not the dense, woolly pelt of a mammoth, but still heavy enough to insulate him against bitter winds. The color varies slightly depending on the region and season. Sometimes a darker brown, sometimes more grayish, blending in with snow-dusted landscapes or dead grasses. The real surprise, though, is that neck relatively long and slender compared to many other Ice Age herbivores. At first, you wonder if this would have made heat conservation more difficult, with more exposed surface area, vulnerable to cold. But nature has always had a few tricks up its sleeve. Modern studies of large mammals suggest that size itself offers an enormous thermal advantage. It's called Bergmann's rule, a biological principle stating that species living in colder environments tend to grow larger. The logic is simple. A bigger body has a smaller surface area-to-volume ratio, meaning less heat escapes into the frigid air. And the Irish elk, well, it took that principle and ran with it. Weighing in at over 1,500 pounds, its sheer bulk helped it conserve precious body heat during long, brutal winters. Those broad flanks weren't just impressive, they were central heating systems wrapped in fur. Still, that doesn't mean winter was easy. You walk now along a frozen ridge, watching as your elk companion uses his broad muzzle to push aside drifts of snow, exposing the tough grasses and shrubs buried beneath. Winter forage was scarce, dry, low in nutrients, and difficult to reach. These massive grazers had to consume enormous amounts of plant matter daily just to fuel their engines even in lean months. Historians still argue whether nutritional stress during harsher winters may have played a role in weakening populations toward the end of the Irish elk's reign. Some suggest that as growing seasons shortened or became more unpredictable due to climate swings, the animals struggled to replenish the mineral reserves necessary for antler growth, reproduction, and basic survival. You pause for a moment and glance at the horizon. The snow reflects a pale, silvery light, beautiful but forbidding. Out here, every winter was a test, not just of strength, but of endurance. And yet, despite these challenges, Irish elk were astonishingly widespread for much of the late Pleistocene. Their range extended across several different climate zones, some milder, some harsher, suggesting they were far more adaptable than many people assume. You pass through a shallow valley now, where ancient winds have sculpted low snow dunes along the edges. The tracks of smaller animals crisscross ahead, hares, foxes, perhaps even lemmings darting beneath the surface. And you realize something else. This entire ecosystem once thrived together, an ice age community that lived and died in delicate balance. Your elk companion, though, remains at the center of this frozen stage. His antlers glisten under a thin veil of frost, now catching stray beams of winter sunlight. Even under these harsh conditions, the display never loses its purpose. A year-round advertisement of health, strength, and resilience. You marvel again at the metabolic toll required to maintain that display year after year. In winter, the demands were especially unforgiving. Not only was food scarce, but the wear and tear of carrying such massive antlers would have taxed muscles, joints, and skeletal structure, particularly in older males. Some researchers suggest that only the strongest males could afford the full antler load year after year, while weaker individuals may have produced smaller, less symmetrical racks, a visible signal of declining health. Nature offered no mercy here. Every weakness was broadcast for the world to see. And while predators stalked the weak and human hunters stalked the bold, the environment itself was the most constant adversary. As Ice Age cycles advanced and retreated, weather patterns shifted unpredictably. What may have been a stable grassland 1 century could transform into a swampy mire or dense woodland in the next. You climb now to a small rise overlooking a frozen lake. Its surface a glistening sheet of pale blue, broken only by scattered pockets of snow. Your companion pauses here too, head held high, nostrils flaring as he breathes deeply into the cold. The lake below is one of many glacial relics left behind by the advancing and retreating ice sheets that define this era. These shifting glaciers not only reshaped landscapes, but altered river systems, plant distributions, and animal migrations on continental scales. You realize that while the Irish elk was remarkably suited to its environment for much of its reign, it was also vulnerable to its ever-changing rules. Even tiny changes in snowfall patterns or spring thaw timing could ripple outward, affecting grass growth, mineral availability, predator movements, and ultimately survival rates. For now though, the world stands still. The herd gathers below by the lake's edge, small clouds of breath rising as they graze what little remains exposed. A fragile peace holds at least until the next storm rolls in, or until history's slow, grinding wheel turns one notch closer toward extinction. The great elk stands beside you as if contemplating this same quiet truth, that even giants must yield eventually to the patience of time. As you continue your quiet trek alongside the herd, your boots crunching through thin layers of ice, you begin to notice just how much of this world revolves around one simple, unglamorous truth. Grass? Yes, grass. Not the lush, manicured lawns you might see today, but wide, endless carpets of hardy, nutrient-rich grasses stretching across the Ice Age. Steppes like a living ocean. For the Irish elk, these grasses were everything: their fuel, their survival, and indirectly the reason for their massive size. You watch your giant companion lean down again, sweeping snow aside with a practiced motion, exposing tufts of brittle grass beneath. Even after thousands of years, these ancient grasslands remain imprinted in the bones of the land, silent witnesses to the feast that once sustained entire megafaunal communities. Unlike modern deer who often browse on shrubs, leaves, and tender shoots, the Irish elk was primarily a grazer, a grass specialist. Its broad, flat teeth were designed to grind tough, fibrous plant material down into something digestible, while its complex, multi-chambered stomach worked overtime to extract every ounce of nutrition. This adaptation allowed the Irish elk to thrive on the vast steppes and tundras of the late Pleistocene habitats, similar to today's Serengeti, but colder, windier, and far more seasonal. Grass was plentiful for much of the year, regrowing rapidly after spring thaws, and spreading like wildfire across the open plains. Historians still argue whether this specialization locked the Irish elk into an ecological corner. As long as these open grasslands remained stable, their population thrived. But as climates shifted, growing warmer weather, or simply more erratic, grassland ecosystems began shrinking or transforming entirely. You pause at the edge of a small frozen clearing now, where the grasses poke stubbornly through the snow. From here, you can almost map out the rise and fall of these great grazing fields, how they expanded during cooler, drier glacial periods, only to contract when the ice retreated and forests crept back in. During the peak of their reign, these vast grasslands were part of what scientists call the Roe Mammoth Steppe, an enormous continuous ecosystem stretching from Western Europe through Russia, across Siberia, and into parts of Alaska and Canada. It was home not only to Irish elk, but also woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, steppe bison, giant ground sloths, and countless other massive herbivores. You glance upward as a small flock of Ice Age birds takes flight across the sky, their cries sharp and lonely in the frozen air. Every creature here was tied directly or indirectly to the productivity of grass, and therein lay both the strength and fragility of the Irish elk's existence. Their size, their ability to grow those massive antlers, depended on consistent high-quality grazing. During good years, their bodies flourished, their antlers grew wide and symmetrical, and breeding success followed. But in years of drought, shorter growing seasons or environmental disruptions, even a brief decline in food quality could ripple outward, affecting antler growth, fertility, calf survival rates, and ultimately population stability. You spot a young male nearby, his smaller antlers still covered with rough velvet. He seems energetic and eager, but his future, like every member of the herd, depends entirely on whether this coming spring will bring enough rain, enough sun, enough warmth to coax the grasses back to life. The pressure was relentless, and with each generation, as environmental unpredictability increased near the end of the Ice Age, the margins grew thinner. Some paleontologists have suggested that nutrient stress may have led to a slow but steady decline in average antler size toward the species' final days, not because evolution reversed course, but because weakened individuals simply couldn't afford the massive growth anymore. Others counter that the fossil record is too patchy to draw firm conclusions. Once again, scholars still argue, but you can almost feel the tension in the landscape itself. The herd moves onward, now shifting toward a patch of exposed ground where underground springs have kept the snow thinner. Your companion leads confidently his enormous antlers, still broadcasting his strength to both rivals and potential mates. And as you watch him step through these ancient grasses, you can't help but think about modern parallels. Today, many of the world's great grazers, elephants, wildebeest, bison, still live or die by the productivity of grasslands. And like the Irish elk, they too are vulnerable to even subtle shifts in rainfall patterns, temperature, or habitat loss. The balance remains delicate. You step carefully as you descend into a shallow depression carved long ago by glacial meltwater. The grasses here are stunted, frostbitten, a reminder of how quickly even the richest ecosystems can turn fragile. For most of its existence, though, the Irish elk played its part perfectly, a master grazer on a stage built just for creatures of its size and appetite. It had found its niche in the cold, sprawling expanses of Ice Age Europe and Asia. But as the world warmed, as the grasses shrank and the forest returned, this niche began to close. And when the grass thinned, so too did the chances of growing those magnificent antlers, and with them the future of the species itself. The wind quiets for a moment, and in that stillness you feel the strange vulnerability that underpins even the grandest forms of life. Evolution builds titans, but only for as long as the land allows. The cold air sharpens again as you cross a narrow ridge. And for the first time since you started following your antlered companion, you sense something else moving through the shadows, something far less peaceful than the grazing herd. Predators. Out here, even giants like the Irish elk had enemies lurking in the dark. You freeze for a moment listening. In the distance, you hear it faint, soft-footed movement through the snow. A pack of Ice Age wolves. Their gray shapes blur between the trees. Lean, hungry, coordinated. You glance toward the elk herd. The females bunch together slightly, their heads lifting, ears twitching. The younger males shift positions nervously. Even your towering bull stiffens for a moment, antlers rising high, scanning the tree line. This is the price of being a giant grazer. You're not invisible. Not to anything. Wolves weren't the only predators haunting these lands. During the height of the Pleistocene, the Irish elk shared territory with an intimidating cast of hunters, saber-toothed cats, cave lions, cave hyenas, and early humans. The food chain out here wasn't just brutal, It was crowded. While adult Irish elk were likely safe from most smaller predators thanks to their sheer size and strength, the calves, well, they were a different story. Vulnerable, slower, and easier to separate from the herd. Young Irish elk presented perfect opportunities for ambush. You watch as the wolves hesitate now at the tree line, weighing their odds. The adult males form a loose barrier around the herd, their giant antlers spreading wide like shields. Though primarily built for mating displays, those antlers may have served secondary roles, not for killing predators outright, but for keeping them at bay. Historians still argue whether antlers offered meaningful defense against predators. Some paleontologists suggest they served mostly as visual deterrents, rather than weapons, while others believe they may have been swung defensively in close encounters, especially during desperate situations. Unfortunately, fossilized bones rarely preserve stories of battles. Most of what we know comes from educated guesses, modern analogs, and a bit of imagination. You step behind a snow-dusted rock, now observing the tension building. The wolves spread slightly probing for weaknesses. Their cold yellow eyes scan for any sign of a calf straying too far. They know better than to take on a healthy adult head-on, but a misstep, a stumble, or a moment's distractions could open an opportunity. And you realize this isn't just a battle of teeth and antlers, it's a battle of energy economics. The wolves can't afford a high-risk attack that leaves them injured or empty-handed. The elk can't afford to lose even one calf if the herd is to survive harsh winters. Every encounter like this is a gamble played over thousands of years. But humans brought an entirely different kind of pressure. Unlike wolves or saber-toothed cats, early humans hunted with tools, strategy, and patience. Spears, fire, coordinated drives, tactics that allowed them to target even larger animals without exposing themselves to much danger. Small human bands could stalk herds for days, waiting for exhaustion or weather to weaken individuals before striking. You picture them now crouched behind snow-covered rocks, or moving in teams along the edges of a frozen lake. Eyes locked on this enormous deer, calculating the safest way to bring one down. And here lies another vulnerability of the Irish elk. Its massive antlers, so valuable during a mating season, offered no special protection against the methods of human hunters. If anything, they made escape harder in dense, forested terrain where humans could herd them toward narrow passes or traps. You glance back at the wolves as they slowly retreat into the forest shadows. No opportunity today. The herd's defensive circle holds firm. For now, nature's delicate standoff resets once more. But these skirmishes played out daily across thousands of years, formed part of the larger pressure closing in on species like the Irish elk. Predation might not have driven them extinct directly, but combined with climate change, habitat fragmentation, and human hunting, every added threat chipped away at survival margins. You continue walking as the sun dips lower in the sky, painting the snow with soft amber light. The herd relaxes again, resuming their steady, cautious grazing. Around you, the landscape feels vast and eternal, but you know better. This fragile balance was never permanent. You spot a set of claw marks on a nearby tree, perhaps from a cave lion passing through days earlier. Even the kings of the Ice Age jungle wandered these plains looking for prey like your towering companion. And you wonder how many times over millennia did these standoffs play out? How many herds survived because a wolf pack gave up? How many calves were lost in silent ambushes? How many humans patiently tracked a tired bull through the forest before landing a well-placed spear? The Irish elk lived with constant threats pressing from every direction. And yet, for tens of thousands of years they endured. They adapted, they grew, and they ruled these grasslands giants, who somehow balanced the constant danger of life on the edge. For now, the wolves are gone. The shadows lengthen. The elk lower their heads once more, returning to their endless task, eating, surviving, and preparing for whatever tomorrow brings. The sun hangs lower now, casting longer shadows across the snowy plains as you follow the herd into a broad valley. The air is still almost deceptively peaceful. But here, beneath the calm, you begin to glimpse another layer of the Irish elk's long struggle. One shaped not by predators, but by the cleverest hunters of all early humans and their evolving hunting strategies. At first, you might think that humans were no match for such towering giants. After all, what could a small band of lightly armed people possibly do against a herd of elk carrying antlers wider than a family car? But you forget one critical advantage. Humans played a long, patient game. While wolves relied on speed, ambush, and brute strength, humans developed something far more dangerous: coordinated tactics. You imagine it now as you follow the elk's trail, small groups of hunters studying the herd's movements for days, perhaps weeks. They watched which valleys the elk preferred for grazing, which streams they visited to drink, and where they gathered during calving season. This wasn't random opportunism. It was deliberate observation, the slow accumulation of knowledge. And then, when the moment was right, the humans acted. Sometimes they used terrain itself as a weapon, herding elk into natural bottlenecks, narrow passes between rocky cliffs, steep riverbanks, or dense patches of forest where escape routes were limited. Other times, they drove herds toward carefully constructed traps or over low embankments where injuries would slow the animals down. Spears were their primary tool, often flung from a distance, using atlatl spear throwers that dramatically increased range and force. A well-placed throw could wound even the largest of elk, bleeding them slowly until exhaustion finished the job. You pause as you come upon a stretch of ground where the snow has partially melted. Embedded in the frozen soil are scattered shards of flint, ancient debris left behind from tool-making. Perhaps a hunting party once rested here, sharpening their blades, waiting for the right opportunity. Unlike the opportunistic wolf pack or the lone saber-toothed humans didn't need to rely on luck or brute force. They could plan, adapt, and most importantly, share knowledge across generations. Historians still argue whether human hunting pressure alone was enough to drive species like the Irish elk to extinction. Some suggest that early humans were relatively few in number during much of the elk's reign, with their impact being gradual rather than catastrophic. Others believe that as human populations expanded and technologies improved, their growing presence added yet another crushing weight to an already fragile ecosystem. The debate remains open, as do many questions about early human interaction with megafauna. But one thing is certain: once humans entered the equation, the rules changed permanently. You walk quietly behind your companion, now watching as the herd moves along a narrow trail that winds between frozen hillocks. You can almost feel the ghostly presence of those early hunters, always nearby, always watching. But humans weren't just hunters, they were opportunists. And sometimes they took advantage of nature's traps rather than creating their own. Imagine a harsh winter storm sweeping across these plains. Heavy snow covers the grasses, freezing rains harden the ground. and deep drifts make movement exhausting. In such conditions, even strong adults may stumble. Weak individuals may fall behind. And when that happened early, humans were ready to strike. You spot a low depression ahead, likely a natural pit, where animals occasionally became stuck in deep snow or mud during warmer months. Such places acted like primitive sinkholes, where desperate animals flailed helplessly, providing easy meals for both predators and scavengers alike. The Irish elk, for all its strength and grandeur, was not immune to these accidents. Its heavy body and wide antlers made maneuvering through unstable terrain risky. In these vulnerable moments, even the strongest male might fall victim not to a direct attack but to simple misfortune, followed closely, of course, by hungry opportunists, and so the pressure mounted from all sides. You glance to your left and see an exposed antler tine, poking through the snow the remains of one who didn't make it. Its pale surface catches the fading light, a silent marker of countless similar struggles across the ages. The humans, for their part, may have viewed the Irish elk with a mix of reverence and practicality. There's evidence that some ancient cave art may depict these giants, their massive antlers etched into stone walls by firelight. While definitive proof remains scarce, it's easy to imagine early humans both respecting and depending on these animals for survival, meat for food, antlers for tools or status symbols, hides for warmth, bones for crafting. The Irish elk was a walking storehouse of valuable resources, a prize worth the risk. You step over another narrow stream as the herd pauses near a cluster of birch trees. The females graze carefully while the males remain alert, constantly scanning for danger. They've learned these threats over countless generations, the silent language of fear, passed down in blood and instinct. And yet, despite everything the species endured, for tens of thousands of years they navigated this gauntlet of predators, hunters, and harsh winters. The fact that you're here observing them in this frozen moment is a testament to just how successful they were, until at last the world shifted too far. The sun sinks even lower now, painting the snow in shades of soft rose and gold. Another day survived. Another silent victory in a war fought without end. You follow the herd onward, knowing that soon you'll see how the pressures they faced would only continue to grow. The twilight deepens as you follow the herd into the lower valley. Shadows stretch long across the snow, and for a moment the landscape feels almost gentle again. But don't let the stillness fool you. The Irish elk's life was a relentless balancing act, and nowhere was that clearer than when it came to their antlers versus predators. You pause on a ridge, watching as your towering companion leads the group with his enormous rack swaying from side to side. The more you watch, the more you realize how strangely impractical those magnificent antlers were when danger struck. For all their grandeur, they weren't exactly designed for swift getaways or close-quarter combat. Yes, they were excellent for mating displays, rival intimidation, and even deflecting would-be challengers. But when it came to actual survival, outrunning a pack of wolves or dodging an ambush in dense brush, those 12-foot headpieces became something closer to a liability. Imagine sprinting for your life while carrying a full dining table strapped to your forehead. Trees hazards, rocky outcrops, death traps, narrow passes, forget it. The wider the antlers, the fewer escape routes remained open. If a predator could funnel a fleeing elk into tight quarters, the advantage shifted rapidly. And yet, they weren't completely defenseless. When cornered, an Irish elk could potentially lower its head and swing those antlers in wide, sweeping arcs. One well-timed strike could break ribs or shatter limbs of an attacking predator. Wolves knew this. So did saber-toothed cats. The risk of serious injury made most predators cautious, especially when dealing with healthy adults. Historians still argue whether these antlers provided any real defense beyond psychological deterrence. There's limited fossil evidence of predator-inflicted injuries on adult Irish elk skeletons, suggesting that direct attacks were relatively rare or at least rarely successful. Many believe predators targeted calves and sick individuals, far more often choosing safer prey, rather than risk a fatal antler strike. You watch now as the herd tightens formation, a subtle but critical defense mechanism. The calves stay near the center, flanked by females, and guarded by the few dominant males with their towering antlers forming a living wall. It's not unlike how modern bison or musk oxen form defensive circles when wolves approach. And yet, in open fields, these antlers worked at least most of the time. The problem came when the environment shifted. As Ice Age forests spread into areas once dominated by grasslands, the Irish elk faced new challenges. The open expanses where their antlers shone brightest slowly filled with trees. Dense undergrowth limited visibility. Escape routes narrowed. And predators who thrived in these tighter shadowed spaces, wolves, lions, even early humans gained the upper hand. You walk now through one such transitioning forest where young birch and pine trees crowd the narrow trail. Even here you can see how difficult movement would have been for antlered giants. Your companion weaves carefully, head tilted, calculating each turn. You almost feel your own neck ache just watching. Every added foot of antler spread made these tight corridors increasingly hazardous. A wrong turn might not only trap an elk, but leave it vulnerable to waiting hunters. This wasn't just a matter of personal inconvenience. It was an existential problem for the species. You kneel beside a fallen tree, now brushing snow from its broken trunk. The undergrowth is thick here, perfect for ambushes. You imagine wolves lurking just beyond the shrubs, eyes glinting as they wait for a misstep. Predators didn't need to defeat strength directly, they simply needed to exploit weakness. And as the environment grew more cluttered, weakness became easier to find. You rise and catch up with your companion as he emerges into a small clearing. The herd breathes easier out here, their tight formation loosening slightly. But even now, the defensive posturing never fully relaxes. Every ear still swivels. Every nose still tests the air. In these moments, you start to appreciate how much of the Irish elk's survival strategy revolved around minimizing risk, rather than defeating it outright. Don't stray far. Stay near the strongest males. Avoid confined spaces. Move constantly. Eat quickly. Sleep lightly. For tens of thousands of years, it worked barely. And yet, evolution is relentless. Every advantage becomes a disadvantage when the context shifts. What once impressed females became a curse in crowded forests. What once deterred predators became clumsy baggage in tangled thickets. The arms race that built these magnificent antlers never paused to ask whether the world would remain suitable for such excess. The clouds rolled thicker overhead, now casting deep shadows across the landscape. The herd pushes forward again, cautious but steady. You can almost sense the long arc of history bending beneath your feet, how every step these animals take carries not just weight but legacy. They are survivors, yes, but also prisoners of their own success. For now, though, your companion lifts his head once more, antlers gleaming as the first flakes of fresh snow begin to fall. The night grows colder. The shadows deepen. But the herd moves on as it always has for now. The falling snow thickens, blanketing the valley in a fresh layer of quiet. The herd presses forward into the dusk, and as you continue following them, another part of their story rises from the frozen ground, one far older than written words but still speaking to us today. The cave art cameos. You step softly into a shallow rock overhang ahead, your torchlight flickering gently against the stone, here shielded from wind and rain. For tens of thousands of years, faint images dance across the walls. They're crude by modern standards, but unmistakable long-legged animals, heads crowned with wide-branching antlers. You're looking at some of the earliest known portraits of the Irish elk. These ancient artists, likely some of the very humans who hunted these giants, left behind an astonishing visual record, though many debates still swirl around the exact identification of every figure. Several cave art sites in Europe contain images strongly believed to depict the Irish elk. Their signature antlers, sprawling sideways and upwards, are too distinctive to mistake for anything else. One famous site is Lascaux Cave in France, where some researchers argue that certain antlered figures may represent Megaloceros alongside mammoths, bison, and horses. While not every scholar agrees, interpretations of prehistoric art remain notoriously tricky. The possibility remains tantalizing. Here, in flickering torchlight, you realize something fascinating to these early humans. The Irish elk was not just food. It was a presence, a symbol, an animal so grand it demanded inclusion in their most sacred spaces. These weren't casual doodles. Scrawled between hunts, they were cultural expressions, part of early humanity's attempt to understand and honor the world around them. Historians still argue whether these images were simple hunting records, spiritual symbols, or elaborate storytelling devices passed down through generations. Some suggest the antlers represented power or fertility, perhaps even serving as totemic icons for clans who depended on these herds for survival. You brush your gloved fingers gently across one painted antler, tracing the wide span. The artist exaggerated the antler's spread larger than life, much like the evolutionary forces that shaped them. It's a surreal connection across time, your fingers now following lines laid down by a human hand, perhaps 20,000 years ago. And yet, these ancient murals serve as more than artistic fascination. They're one of the few windows we have into how early humans saw their world and how deeply the Irish elk featured in that view. Imagine the scene after a successful hunt. A group of humans gather in this very shelter, retelling the story of their victory. The great antlers loom large in their memory, both literal and symbolic. Perhaps they believed that by capturing the animal in art, they honored its spirit or guaranteed future hunting success. Or perhaps it was simply awe, the same awe you feel standing here now. Beyond Europe, similar depictions have surfaced elsewhere, etched into bones, carved onto antlers, or even sculpted into small figurines. The Irish elk's outsized presence wasn't limited to biology alone. It had crept into early human culture stories and likely their beliefs about the world. You step back into the snow as your companion reappears, his wide antlers cutting across the dim light like the very drawings on the cave wall. It's easy to see why ancient artists became obsessed with this creature's silhouette. It doesn't simply walk, it commands attention. A living monument, a walking icon. Even today, the antlers of Megaloceros capture modern imaginations. Museums proudly display massive skulls and racks, drawing visitors who stare up in disbelief, trying to fathom how such a creature once walked the earth. You've seen it too. People instinctively reach for their phones to take photos, their heads tilting back to follow the full spread. In many ways, the Irish elk has enjoyed a strange kind of immortality. Though extinct, its image lives on not just in dusty fossil drawers, but in human art, stretching back to the dawn of creativity itself. The snow crunches softly under your boots as you return to the herd. They move quietly under a pale moon, the snowfall glittering in the silver light. The antlers sway rhythmically like sails on an invisible sea of cold air. And as you walk, you realize even extinction cannot erase the legacy these giants carved into our shared history. Their bones may lie buried beneath peat and ice, but their forms remain etched into cave walls, museum halls, and now your own imagination. You glance up one more time as your antlered guide pauses on a ridge, silhouetted perfectly against the moon. Like a living echo of those ancient paintings brought back to life. The night deepens as you continue your silent walk behind the herd, the snow crunching beneath your feet in steady rhythm. Above you, the sky glows with distant stars, cold, clear, and ancient. But beneath this serene blanket lies one of the most debated turning points in the Irish elk's story. Did climate seal their fate? For thousands of years, the Irish elk thrived under conditions that, while harsh, were consistent enough to sustain their needs. Cold but dry glacial plains, rich with grasses and low shrubs, supported their enormous size and even more enormous antlers. But as the Ice Age began to retreat, nature changed the rules. You feel the first hints of that shift as a warmer breeze brushes against your face. The snow here grows thinner, the soil softer, the trees taller and denser. This is what scientists call the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. A time roughly 11,700 years ago, when global temperatures rose, ice sheets retreated, and ecosystems rapidly reshaped themselves. At first glance, you might think warmer climates should have helped these giants. After all, milder winters and longer growing seasons sound like good news for grazers. But ecosystems aren't simple, and for highly specialized creatures like the Irish elk, even small shifts created dangerous domino effects. You observe your companion as he pauses at the forest's edge, hesitant. Here, the open grasslands fade into young, thickening woodlands. Shrubs tangle along the forest floor. Tree trunks crowd together like the bars of a narrowing cage. This was no longer a world designed for creatures hauling 12-foot antlers. As forests spread the grasses, their primary food source retreated. New plant species emerged, many less nutritious or harder to digest. Competition for limited open spaces grew fiercer. And as the corridors of open land shrank, so too did the available room for wide-antlered males to maneuver safely. Historians still argue whether these habitat shifts were the primary cause of the Irish elk's extinction, or merely one link in a larger chain of pressures. Some point to rapidly expanding forests across Europe and Asia as a major factor, while others suggest the species might have adapted had other threats not been simultaneously mounting. You continue walking now through a narrow wooded trail ducking low branches, and you see for yourself what the elk faced. Moving through forests like these with massive spreading antlers wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. One wrong turn, one low-hanging branch, and a panicked flight from predators could turn fatal. And yet, it wasn't only about trees. Warming climates also altered rainfall patterns, shifting water availability across regions. Some traditional grazing grounds may have dried up entirely, while others became swampy and unsuitable for heavy-bodied grazers. The reliable seasonal cycles that once governed these ecosystems grew increasingly unpredictable. You crouch beside a shallow pond, its muddy edges thick with reeds. In wetter regions like these, heavy animals like the Irish elk risked becoming mired, trapped in sticky mud where even predators wouldn't need to intervene. Fossil beds across Europe contain tragic evidence of such events, entire skeletons found, locked in ancient peat bogs and marshes where unlucky individuals sank beyond rescue. Even the elk's own physiology may have worked against it here. Its long legs and splayed hooves were excellent for supporting its weight on hard frozen ground, but on soft, unstable mud, that same design became a trap. You rise and glance ahead, watching as the herd moves cautiously around a marshy patch. Their instincts tell them where danger hides. But instincts can only do so much when the world shifts this dramatically. And still the pressures continue to pile. As climate change forced plant communities to shift and fragment the mineral-rich grazing lands, critical for antler growth became patchier and less reliable. Without access to consistent calcium and phosphorus sources, some males may have struggled to produce full antlers, reducing their reproductive success and accelerating population decline. You glance toward your companion's antlers again, wide, symmetrical, perfect, but you wonder how many others failed to reach this level of display. How many were born into marginal habitats where growing full-sized racks was no longer possible. Some scientists propose that this nutritional stress hypothesis explains why we see signs of shrinking antler sizes in some of the species' final fossil records. A quiet sign that the old system was unraveling. The herd moves onward again, navigating through increasingly fragmented patches of open land like islands in a spreading sea of forest. Each generation faced fewer choices, narrower migration routes, and ever-dwindling resources. And yet, for much of their final centuries they endured. The Irish elk held on longer than many of their Ice Age peers. While mammoths and saber-toothed cats disappeared from vast regions, Megaloceros persisted stubborn, magnificent, and heartbreakingly vulnerable. The stars shift overhead now, and you feel the cold returning. But the herd keeps moving, searching for what remains of their ancient feeding grounds. You realize that in many ways, extinction isn't always dramatic. Often it's quiet, a slow fading rather than a sudden fall. For the Irish elk, climate didn't kill them overnight, it simply chipped away at the foundation of their world, one disrupted grassland at a time. Ahead of you, your giant companion pauses again, his breath steaming gently in the moonlight. His antlers reach skyward, casting long shadows across the shrinking fields, silent monuments to a world that could no longer support their weight. You continue behind the herd as dawn starts breaking, pale light, bleeding slowly across the frozen plains. The gentle glow brings your focus back once more to those impossible antlers and to one of the most persistent haunting questions surrounding the Irish elk's fate. Were the antlers themselves ultimately too much? It's hard not to ask that question as you watch your companion move forward. Every graceful turn, every careful step, carries the burden of those enormous structures sweeping wide on either side. For all their majesty were these grand displays nature's fatal gamble. As you've already seen, sexual selection pushed antler size to staggering extremes. But there's a theory, both simple and brutal, that the antlers may have crossed a tipping point where they stopped being advantageous and instead became actively harmful. This is known as the antler burden hypothesis. The idea is straightforward. The antlers became so big, so heavy, and so awkward that they interfered with everyday survival tasks: foraging, movement, predator evasion, even simple navigation through forests. Over time, the argument goes, this burden may have led to decreased reproductive success and higher mortality rates. Historians still argue how much weight to give this hypothesis. Some paleontologists view it as one key piece in a broader puzzle. Others suggest it oversimplifies the complex interplay between environment behavior and biology. After all, the Irish elk successfully carried these antlers for tens of thousands of years. They weren't suddenly unsustainable overnight. But as you watch your companion pause at the edge of another thickening forest patch, you start to feel the pressure yourself. The margin for error here is razor thin. He tilts his head carefully, maneuvering the wide rack through clustered branches with the delicacy of a tightrope walker. It's a remarkable display of control, but one that requires constant vigilance. Imagine having to calculate every turn of your head, every choice of pathway, every step forward, knowing that a single misjudged movement could leave you stuck or vulnerable to predators lurking nearby. Now, layer on top the growing challenges of the changing environment: shrinking grasslands, unpredictable food sources, harsher winters, and expanding human presence. Even small disadvantages start to add up when everything else around you is shifting. You kneel briefly beside a fallen antler, lying partially buried beneath the snow. It's enormous even on its own. You run your gloved hand along the ridged beam, feeling the sheer mass of it, a weight that once sat atop a living creature's head year after year. Studies of fossilized Irish elk skulls show evidence of powerful neck and shoulder muscles designed to support such loads. Their spines show adaptations for stabilizing the head, compensating for the forward-shifted center of gravity. Evolution had crafted them into living cranes, biomechanical marbles built for balance. And yet, as conditions worsened, that careful design may have turned into a trap. Some researchers propose that younger males face especially steep challenges. In years where nutrition was limited, growing full-size antlers became even more difficult. Smaller antlers meant reduced mating success, which meant fewer offspring, further weakening population numbers. You watch as a younger bull steps forward near the herd, his antlers smaller, less symmetrical than your dominant companions. In better years, perhaps he would have stood a chance. But now, in this dwindling world, even minor shortcomings become magnified. The weight of evolutionary pressure presses down harder with every generation. And yet, the Irish elk wasn't entirely unique in this precarious balancing act. You think of modern examples: peacocks, dragging enormous tails, fiddler crabs, waving oversized claws, even songbirds, whose elaborate courtship rituals burn vast amounts of energy. Sexual selection has always flirted with self-destruction. The Irish elk simply pushed that gamble to its most extreme terrestrial limits. You rise and follow the herd again as they approach another mineral leak, a patch of exposed soil, rich in calcium and salts, critical for replenishing the nutrients drained each year by antler growth. You realize how tightly their lives revolved around finding these resources, not just food, but the raw ingredients for their towering displays. But what happens when mineral leaks dry up, when grass quality declines, when longer winters stretch these thin reserves even further? Each additional burden chips away at population stability. The herd grazes quietly now, their breath rising in soft clouds. Around them, the ancient struggle continues, balancing beauty against survival, strength against risk. And still your giant companion lifts his head antlers, gleaming in the weak light. Even here near the end, the display remains magnificent, a final stubborn declaration that for all its costs, the gamble was once worth it. You pause, taking one last look at the spreading antlers cutting against the pale morning sky. It's a design so extreme it defies logic, and yet it existed. It thrived. And for thousands of years, it dominated one of the harshest environments Earth has ever known. Until slowly the scales tipped. The wind returns as you continue your journey, swirling loose snow across the plains. But beneath your boots, something different crunches now. Not just snow or ice, but the ancient remnants of those who came before, hidden fossil graveyards. You pause and kneel beside a shallow depression, where the thaw has exposed part of a massive skull, its wide, empty eye sockets staring back through time, its sprawling antler beams reaching sideways, like ancient tree roots petrified in place. This was one of many. Across Europe and Asia, astonishingly well-preserved fossil beds have gifted us snapshots of the Irish Elk's long reign. Some of the richest discoveries come not from dry caves or rocky deserts, but from unlikely places. Bogs, marshes, and former lakes, whose waterlogged conditions created perfect time capsules. Peat bogs in Ireland, for example, have yielded complete skeletons so intact that even fragile bones remain articulated lying, just as they fell thousands of years ago. The damp, acidic, oxygen-poor environment of these bogs slowed decay to a crawl, preserving bone, antler, and sometimes even traces of soft tissue far longer than open ground ever could. You gently run your gloved fingers across the smooth, mineral-darkened surface of the exposed antler tip. The weight of time settles on your shoulders as you imagine this once towering creature grazing, moving, fighting, unaware that one day it would become part of science's forensic puzzle. In Siberia, even larger fossil fields lie buried beneath ancient floodplains. Here, the bones of mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant deer, and other Ice Age titans cluster together, sometimes jumbled by river floods, sometimes lying undisturbed where entire herds may have perished together after falling through weakened ice or becoming trapped in thick mud. You rise and continue forward into a shallow basin where scattered bones protrude like brittle fingers from the snow. Some belong to Irish elk. Others may be ancient bison or wild horses that once shared this ecosystem. It's a haunting reminder that mass death wasn't always violent. Nature often claimed its victims quietly: a brutal winter, a sudden flood, or simple misfortune, while foraging near unstable ground. Historians still argue over how many of these mass death sites were caused by catastrophic events, sudden storms, volcanic winters, or glacial meltwater floods that overwhelmed entire populations in single disastrous moments. Others suggest many sites reflect the slow accumulation of individual deaths over millennia, preserved together by the sheer luck of perfect conditions. Either way, these graveyards have become treasure troves for modern paleontologists. Each bone offers clues, not just about anatomy, but about diet, health, and even seasonal behaviors. Microscopic analysis of Irish elk teeth has revealed seasonal growth rings much like trees. By studying these rings, scientists can reconstruct feeding patterns, nutritional stresses, and even infer which seasons were most challenging for survival. Spoiler alert: winter was rarely kind. Isotope analysis of fossilized bones has also shed light on their diets. Irish elk primarily grazed on grasses, but likely supplemented with shrub and herbs when grass was scarce. Their ability to switch food sources may have offered brief reprieve as environments shifted, but not enough to offset the mounting pressures. You pause again as your companion leads the herd across a narrow rise, their wide hooves crunching gently over ground that likely holds countless more bones buried beneath. With each step, they walk across the remains of their ancestors, though of course they have no concept of the long legacy beneath their feet. For paleontologists, however, these fossil beds offer rare windows into Ice Age ecosystems. The spacing of bones, the condition of antlers, the size variations across individuals all tell part of the story. Were males growing smaller antlers near the end? Were individuals thinner or weaker? Were disease and inbreeding taking hold? Every new discovery offers both answers and fresh mysteries. One particularly famous site, Ballybeta Bog in Ireland, has yielded numerous nearly complete Irish elk skeletons, their enormous antlers still locked in place. Standing in front of one today feels almost absurd. Even modern museum visitors, used to seeing elephants, whales, and other giants, find themselves tilting their heads back, mouths open, trying to comprehend the sheer scale. And as you watch your living companion continue forward, you're struck again by how surreal it all seems. These antlers weren't fantasy. They weren't exaggeration. They existed in massive, awkward, beautiful reality for tens of thousands of years. You reach a small overlook now, where the frozen ground drops away into a wide plain, below a place that millennia ago may have been one of these very graveyards. You picture it herds, trapped by deep snow, collapsing ice, or sudden spring floods their remains, slowly settling into the sediment to be discovered thousands of years later. And you realize how fragile even giants can be. No predator needed to chase them down. No disease needed to wipe them out instantly. Sometimes all it took was one bad winter, one weak spot in the ice, one unlucky stumble. The snow swirls again as the herd presses onward, oblivious to the bones beneath them, but you know better now. You've seen the silent layers of history buried in this landscape, and you know the end of this story is drawing ever closer. The wind calms as you descend into the wide plain following your companion's steady gait. The snow thins here, revealing patches of frost-touched grass and shallow streams winding through the open land. And for the first time in your long walk, you feel the scale of the Irish Elk's range truly settle in. Europe wasn't the whole story. Yes, the name Irish Elk sticks stubbornly, mostly thanks to the rich fossil discoveries in Ireland's bogs. But this magnificent creature roamed far beyond the green hills of that small island. In truth, its full domain spanned nearly the entire northern expanse of Eurasia, stretching from the British Isles across mainland Europe, through the vast steppe lands of Russia, and well into Siberia. You stop for a moment picturing its vast herds, moving eastward across open plains that back then looked very different from the patchwork of forests, cities, and farmlands we know today. This was once an endless sea of grass and ice. The Mammoth Steppe, one of the largest ecosystems Earth has ever known. The Mammoth Steppe wasn't just home to mammoths, of course. It was a thriving megafaunal wonderland. Woolly rhinos, steppe, bison, wild horses, cave bears, saber-toothed cats, and of course the great Irish elk. Their world stretched continuously from Western Europe to the eastern edges of Siberia, a vast, mostly open ecosystem, perfectly suited to large grazers. And while many modern maps cut Eurasia and North America apart, it's worth remembering that during a parts of the Ice Age, the Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia to Alaska, though no clear evidence suggests Irish elk ever crossed into North America. Some of their relatives in the Cervidae family certainly did. Moose, elk, wapiti, and various deer species all made that transcontinental leap. Historians still argue why the Irish elk itself remained confined to Eurasia. Was it a matter of climate barriers, competition with North American species, or was their highly specialized antler design simply too poorly suited for the dense conifer forests of Alaska and Canada? Whatever the reason, the Irish elk's kingdom remained firmly Eurasian, and for tens of thousands of years it ruled unchallenged across its massive domain. You glance toward your companion again, who now pauses to drink from a narrow stream cutting across the plain. The icy water flows softly beneath thin sheets of glassy ice, reflecting the rising sun. The world feels so open here. A glimpse of what those ancient grasslands once offered. In the east, the Siberian herds likely faced slightly different challenges. Winters were harsher, temperatures more extreme. But ironically, these conditions may have offered certain advantages. Open tundra and steppe remained intact longer here than in warmer, more forested Western Europe. Indeed, some of the most recent fossil evidence for Irish elk comes from these eastern regions, suggesting that small populations may have lingered longer in remote parts of Siberia, even as the species disappeared elsewhere. It's a reminder that extinction rarely happens everywhere at once. Small holdout populations can sometimes persist long after a species has vanished from its primary range. These final outposts become biological embers, glowing faintly for a while, before finally going dark. You step carefully over exposed patches of frozen ground, where sharp-edged stones poke through thin layers of snow. Beneath your feet lies a land once packed with migratory corridors, stretching for hundreds, even thousands of miles. These long migrations weren't random wanderings. The Irish elk likely followed seasonal cycles, moving north in summer as grasses flourished under the long Arctic daylight, then retreating south again as the harsh winter descended. The open steppe allowed for vast movements in search of fresh grazing grounds, mineral leaks, and safe calving areas. But as climates shifted, forests advanced, and human pressure increased, these ancient highways fragmented. Migration routes were pinched off. Once productive grasslands turned to marshes or woodlands. What had once been a continuous world became increasingly patchy and broken. And here, once again, their greatest asset, those magnificent antlers, became a cruel disadvantage. The wide open spaces that made such antlers advantageous were vanishing, leaving fewer safe pathways for movement and breeding. You imagine a lone male wandering these fragmented corridors late in the species' reign, antlers swaying as he tries to navigate increasingly unfamiliar terrain, smaller herds, shrinking food sources, and dangerous narrowing pathways. The Irish elk was in many ways a creature built for a particular world, one that no longer exists. And as you stand now on this silent frozen plain, once part of the greatest grazing system Earth ever knew, you feel both the grandeur and fragility of that long-lost world. Your companion lifts his head one more time, breath steaming against the cold air, eyes scanning the open horizon. For now, his world remains, but you know that beyond the next rise, beyond the next century, even these last strongholds will begin to crumble. The slow march toward extinction isn't a sudden collapse. It's a long, quiet narrowing of land, of choices, of chances. But for this moment in this open patch of the mammoth steppe, the Irish elk still walks, and you walk with it, knowing you're witnessing the closing chapters of one of nature's most spectacular experiments. The landscape narrows once again as you follow the herd into a low valley where the snow collects like heavy drapes along the rocky slopes. The air grows still and the mood shifts. You sense it in the herd too, a certain watchfulness, a tension that never fully fades for duration. The young bucks. Among the Irish elk life as a juvenile male was no gentle apprenticeship. From the moment they were born, young bulls faced an uphill battle, one that would determine whether they would ever get a chance to pass on their genes or fade quietly into evolutionary obscurity. You pause to observe a cluster of these younger males gathered a short distance from the core herd, their antlers still modest in size compared to the towering adults, carry the hopeful beginnings of the extravagant displays that may one day define their success or failure. Unlike the fully grown bulls, these subadults aren't yet allowed to compete directly for mates. The dominant males keep them at a distance during breeding season, a quiet form of social exile that's as old as the species itself. They linger at the edges, learning, practicing, watching. The stakes for these young males are brutally high. To join the ranks of dominant breeders one day, they must first survive years of intense physical growth, nutritional demands, and environmental hazards, all while carefully managing energy reserves to fuel both body size and antler growth. You watch as one young buck lowers his head, mock sparring with another, their antlers clacking gently like a rehearsal. These practice bouts aren't just for fun, they're critical training. In future years, when their antlers finally reach full size, these same sparring moves may become matters of life, death, and reproduction. Historians still argue how much attrition occurred during these early years. Some fossil evidence suggests that many Irish elk simply never lived long enough to reach full antler maturity. Nutritional stress, harsh winters, predation, and accidents all conspired to thin the ranks long before they had a chance to face off in true antlered combat. You can feel the biological gamble unfolding in every movement these young males make. Each year, as they grow larger, their caloric needs skyrocket. Growing even modest antlers demands vast amounts of calcium, phosphorus, and protein resources not always guaranteed in an Ice Age world increasingly fragmented by climate shifts. And the costs aren't just short-term. Studies of modern deer suggest that individuals who overexert themselves on antler growth while young may compromise bone strength, immunity, and long-term survival. For the Irish elk, these pressures would have been even more severe. You crouch by a small mineral lick where several juveniles have gathered, licking at the exposed earth to pull vital nutrients into their developing systems. This quiet scene plays out across generations, a daily race to acquire the building blocks needed to support their escalating antler arms race. Yet, even as they grow stronger, their window for success remains narrow. You glance again at the dominant bull nearby your towering companion, his antlers wide and flawless. He represents what these young bucks are working toward. But for every male who reaches such size and symmetry, dozens never will. Some will fall to wolves. Others will simply fail to grow sufficiently large antlers to attract females when the time comes. Sexual selection is rarely gentle. It favors the spectacular but offers no safety nets for those who fall short. In some ways, it mirrors our own harsh competitions. Job interviews, athletic trials, even modern dating, where small differences snowball into life-altering outcomes. The Irish elk played nature's version of that endless competition on a stage far less forgiving. And yet, even for those that succeed, the prize remains temporary. Once dominant, a male may only enjoy a few short years of mating success before being outcompeted by younger, stronger rivals. Worn joints, depleted mineral reserves, or simple bad luck may push once proud bulls back to the periphery. The snow swirls again as the juveniles break up their sparring session, returning to grazing. Each mouthful of grass represents one more small victory in their long, exhausting march toward reproductive viability. But you know that as climate instability grows, these delicate balances become harder to maintain. With shrinking food sources, increased habitat fragmentation, and rising predation pressures, fewer young bulls will successfully navigate this gauntlet. The herd moves forward once again, and you follow quietly, contemplating how even in a world without guns or machines, life for the Irish elk was already a relentless gamble. One made even more fragile as the Ice Age slipped toward its end. Ahead, the older bulls lead the way. Behind them, the young bucks trail with patient ambition, their antlers still growing hopeful, determined and entirely at the mercy of a world that grows less hospitable with each passing season. The morning sun breaks through thin bands of cloud as the herd reaches the edge of a wide open field. Here, for a brief moment, the world feels almost timeless again, a flat stretch of grass and frost eerily resembling the ancient plains where the Irish elk once thrived at their peak. Your attention shifts now to one of the most extraordinary and exhausting aspects of their biology: the annual drop and regrow ritual. You watch as one of the dominant males grazes nearby. His antlers shimmer faintly in the sunlight, but you know in just a few weeks they'll be gone. Each year, like clockwork, Irish elk shed these enormous antlers only to regrow them again with astonishing speed. At first, it sounds almost unbelievable. Why would evolution build a creature that carries 12-foot wide antlers for most of the year only to cast them off, grow them back, and repeat the whole ordeal annually? The answer lies in how all deer species manage their antlers. Unlike horns, which are permanent structures seen in animals like bison or goats, antlers are living tissue, fast-growing, highly vascularized, and deeply connected to hormonal cycles. In the case of the Irish elk, this process was scaled up to absurd proportions. You crouch near a patch of ground littered with broken antler pieces, the remnants of last year's shedding. The bases are clean as though sawed off, but this is nature's work. Each year, as testosterone levels drop after the mating season, specialized cells at the antler base begin reabsorbing bone, weakening the connection until the entire structure falls away. The antlers don't simply snap off. Instead, the blood supply slowly dries up. Eventually, with a final shake or small impact, they detach, often within just a few hours of each other. And then, remarkably, the regrowth begins. Historians still argue whether the energy cost of this process was the Irish elk's ultimate evolutionary burden. The biological demand of regrowing such massive antlers each year was immense, likely the fastest bone growth rate in the entire animal kingdom. In modern deer, antlers can grow up to a centimeter per day. For the Irish elk, it may have been even faster. Imagine that your entire headgear, growing by half an inch every day, ballooning outward over just a few months. It's like building a cathedral on your forehead by midsummer, only to tear it down and start again next spring. And yet the regrowth was essential. Each year's antlers were slightly different, a new opportunity to signal strength and fitness to females and rivals alike. A male with perfectly symmetrical, massive antlers each season sent a clear message. I am strong, healthy, and genetically superior. You watch your companion now, knowing that beneath his skin, the process is already quietly beginning again. As daylight hours grow longer after winter rising, testosterone triggers the first whispers of growth beneath his thick fur. Soon, his head will sprout small knobs, tender and fuzzy with soft velvet. The velvet stage fascinates scientists and nature lovers alike. During this phase, antlers are alive, filled with blood vessels, nerves, and soft tissue. They are incredibly sensitive. A simple bump during this period can cause pain or damage, which may permanently distort the antler's final shape. You imagine your companion moving even more cautiously during those months, carefully protecting his growing rack, until the bone hardens and the velvet dries and falls away. Only then, by late summer or early autumn, will the antlers reach their full gleaming size, ready for the next breeding season's battles and displays. But this relentless cycle comes at a steep price. You've already seen how much calcium and phosphorus the elk must consume or borrow from its own skeleton to fuel this astonishing growth. Each year places strain on the entire system. In younger, healthier bulls, the demands are manageable. But as individuals age, the process becomes riskier. You glance toward an older male, lagging slightly behind the herd. His antlers, though still large, lack the flawless symmetry of the prime bulls. The tines curve awkwardly in places, a quiet signal of declining strength, perhaps, from mineral depletion or past injuries that altered growth. In some ways, the antlers act like a biological scoreboard. Each year's growth records an individual's physical condition, diet, and genetic health, whether they thrive, struggle, or begin to falter. And for the Irish elk in these late stages of their reign, small cracks in that system may have widened quickly. As climates shifted and food quality declined, fewer males may have had the nutritional surplus required to regrow full-sized antlers. Smaller racks meant lower reproductive success, which in turn weakened the population's gene pool even further. You feel the weight of that cycle pressing in as the herd grazes peacefully. For now, the endless, unforgiving contest of energy, minerals, and survival playing out silently beneath every graceful movement. The wind picks up slightly, and you watch as your companion lifts his massive head antlers, swaying like the great branches of some ancient tree. You can almost sense the invisible clock ticking beneath his skin, counting down toward another shedding season. Another regrowth, another roll of nature's evolutionary dice. For now, though, the antlers remain proud, heavy, and impossibly beautiful until the cycle begins again. The wind settles as you follow the herd along a ridge, snow crunching beneath your boots. Yet the questions swirling around the Irish elk's fate remain as restless as ever. Now you step into one of the more curious, even controversial theories that some scientists have floated over the years: the oxygen hypothesis. At first glance, it sounds almost like science fiction, that the enormous size of the Irish elk's body, and especially its antlers, may have been enabled by ancient atmospheric conditions, specifically higher oxygen levels. Let's unpack it. During various periods in Earth's distant past, global oxygen concentrations have fluctuated. In some eras, oxygen levels were significantly higher than they are today. This surplus may have allowed certain prehistoric animals, including the gigantic insects and arthropods of the Carboniferous period, to reach sizes that would be impossible in today's thinner air. Some researchers have asked, could a similar mechanism have contributed even partially to the Irish elk's incredible size? Could slightly elevated oxygen levels during the Pleistocene have fueled not only large body growth but also supported the metabolic demands of growing and carrying those monstrous antlers? Historians still argue fiercely about this one, for most of the Pleistocene oxygen levels weren't dramatically different from today, certainly not high enough to explain the elk's size outright, but even minor fluctuations in local oxygen availability, perhaps combined with other environmental factors, could have played a subtle role in easing metabolic strain during peak growth seasons. You glance toward your massive companion as he lowers his head again to graze wide antlers slicing through low-hanging branches. Even if oxygen levels offered only a small advantage, every edge would have mattered. After all, his body required tremendous energy to drive, not just antler growth but also the heart-lungs muscles and bones that had to support and sustain such a massive structure year-round. Another version of this theory branches slightly that carbon dioxide levels, rather than oxygen alone, may have played an indirect role. Higher CO2 during warmer interglacial periods could have fueled more robust plant growth, improving food quality and abundance across the steppe. In turn, richer plant life might have provided more of the nutrients necessary to sustain these megafauna. You follow the herd across a patch of grass, now revealed beneath melting snow. The variety of plants here is striking: coarse, bunch grasses, frost-hardened sedges, and hardy herbs, each offering its own mixture of minerals and calories. For animals like the Irish elk, not just quantity, but quality of food mattered enormously. Even a slight improvement in forage could help males build stronger bodies and larger antlers during the critical spring and summer growth phases. But here's where the fragility reemerges as climates shifted near the end of the Pleistocene. These favorable plant communities began changing. Wetter climates and advancing forests displaced the open grasslands. Food quality declined. Minerals grew scarcer. The tightrope the Irish elk walked became narrower and more brittle. You stop briefly beside a partially collapsed mineral leak, a shallow depression where generations of elk once gathered to scrape at exposed soil. In years when grasses failed to provide sufficient nutrients, these sites became even more critical. But they too could dry up or become inaccessible as the landscape transformed. Even the idea of increased competition has been floated. As other species from bison to reindeer to early domestic livestock expanded into the same grazing zones, food competition may have further strained the elk's fragile resource balance. The more you consider it, the clearer it becomes. The Irish elk's survival wasn't pinned to one single variable. Instead, it was locked in a web of interconnected pressures: climate, habitat, predation, nutrition, and possibly even minor atmospheric fluctuations, all pulling at the threads of its existence simultaneously. You glance toward the eastern horizon, where thin clouds drift slowly across the pale sky. Somewhere out there beyond these plains, glaciers still lurk, reminders of how volatile this world was for creatures like your antlered companion. It's humbling to realize that even a slight change in temperature or nutrient availability could ripple outward through entire populations. One bad summer might mean smaller antlers the following year. Smaller antlers mean lower mating success, fewer calves born, fewer surviving to adulthood. Over generations, these small pressures quietly hollowed out the herd from within. You resume your walk as the herd presses on across an open field. The massive bull leads confidently, but even he is not immune to these invisible forces tightening around him. And though the oxygen hypothesis remains one of the more fringe debates among scientists, it serves as another reminder of how deeply complex and sometimes delicately absurd the Irish Elk's story truly was. Every advantage came with a cost. Every adaptation carried a risk. Ahead, you can see the land narrowing once again into denser stands of trees. The herd will need to navigate carefully, as always, the same careful dance between open space and danger that has defined their lives for millennia. And you walk beside them, witnessing not just the physical journey, but the gradual unraveling of one of nature's grandest and most precarious evolutionary experiments. The trail bends sharply now, guiding the herd toward a broad basin where winter winds swirl in slow, deliberate circles. As you descend with them, the landscape tells a sobering story. Human competition heats up. If there was one force the Irish elk had never faced for most of its evolutionary history, it was humans at least, not in any serious numbers. For thousands of years, these giants ruled a world where natural predators kept their distance, where survival was largely dictated by climate and the unforgiving cycles of food and growth. But that balance wouldn't last. You stop briefly scanning the far edge of the plain where faint columns of smoke rise into the morning sky, evidence of human encampments tucked between the trees. Fires crackle, shadows move, spears are sharpened, and somewhere among them plants are quietly forming. Humans didn't arrive all at once. They trickled into these Ice Age territories in waves first, as small hunter-gatherer bands, then as increasingly organized communities with rapidly evolving technologies. Their population growth may have been slow compared to modern standards, but for megafauna like the Irish elk, even modest increases in human activity were deeply disruptive. At first, humans may have taken only the vulnerable, sick, or injured animals stumbled upon during migrations. But it didn't take long before hunting strategies grew more sophisticated. You can almost picture it, small groups fanning out across the open plains, reading the herd's movement like seasoned trackers. They understood the weaknesses, the weight of the antlers, the difficulty navigating forests, the danger of muddy bogs. Where predators saw a risky meal, humans saw opportunity. With coordinated drives, humans could funnel herds toward narrow passes or deep snowdrifts where escape was nearly impossible. In some cases, they even used fire-igniting patches of grassland to guide animals into traps or open fields where spear throws could be more effective. Historians still argue whether human hunting pressure alone was enough to push the Irish elk toward extinction. Some researchers point out that for much of the species' history, humans remained relatively few and their impact limited. But others argue that even modest hunting layered atop the mounting environmental pressures may have tipped the delicate balance. You watch now as your massive companion pauses near a frozen stream. His breath billows softly into the cold air, and you sense the unease simmering beneath his calm posture. The herd remains alert, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, always aware of what lurks just beyond sight. Human hunters didn't need to take many elk each season to have an outsized impact. Unlike wolves or lions that targeted only the weak, humans could bring down healthy adults, including prime breeding males whose genes were vital for population recovery. Each successful hunt meant Not only one less adult, but also fewer future calves. A slow attrition that compounded with each passing year. You notice a patch of disturbed earth ahead. Flattened grass, broken branches, and faint footprints half filled with snow. Perhaps a human hunting party passed through here days ago, stalking this very herd. They may have moved on, but their presence remains imprinted on the land like a warning. And it wasn't just hunting. As human populations expanded, they began altering the very landscapes these megafauna depended upon. With simple tools, early humans cleared trees for temporary campsites or managed small patches of grassland to encourage certain plants. Over time, these activities fragmented habitats, subtly but steadily reducing the open corridors the Irish elk needed for safe migration and foraging. Even indirect competition played a role. Humans competed for the same mineral leaks, hunting grounds, and freshwater sources that the elk relied upon. As human mastery over fire tools and cooperation expanded, their ability to dominate these shared resources grew exponentially. You walk quietly now along the edge of the basin, watching the herd move with heightened caution. They no longer live in a world where natural predators alone dictate survival. Now another apex species has entered the stage, one armed not with teeth and claws, but with intelligence coordination and an unsettling ability to reshape entire ecosystems. And while the Irish elk had evolved to thrive in open plains and harsh winters, they were poorly equipped to adapt to this new kind of competition. Unlike wolves or cold snaps, humans didn't obey natural limits. They multiplied, they moved, they innovated. You step around another faint track, a series of shallow depressions where human feet crossed this path not long ago. Their prints fade beneath the snow, but the consequences of their arrival echo loudly through the herd's uneasy movements. The Irish elk didn't understand extinction. They didn't grasp that their world was closing in, but they felt it in the shrinking grasslands, in the fractured migration routes, in the silent arrows flying from the distant hunters, in the loss of once dependable feeding grounds. Ahead, your companion lifts his head once again, scanning the far tree line. The antlers still gleam in the pale light, proud and massive, a masterpiece of evolutionary extravagance. But even now, you sense the future tightening around him. The next generations will face thinner herds, fewer safe spaces, and an ever-growing human footprint pressing from all sides. And still, the herd moves forward, always forward, caught in a long, slow retreat from a world that no longer belongs solely to them. The wind whistles across the exposed ridge. As you follow the herd into a narrow gully, the snow lies undisturbed here, silent and clean. Yet within this quiet, another shadow lingers, one that may have delivered the final quietest blow to these giants. Was disease the final blow? For all the attention given to predators, hunting climate, and antlers, there's a theory, whispered among some paleontologists and ecologists, that disease may have played a role in hastening the Irish elk's extinction. You glance across the herd, noting how tightly they cluster now, especially the calves and younger males. Herd living while offering protection from predators brings its own dangers. When animals gather in large groups, diseases spread quickly. Historians still argue about whether epidemic diseases existed among Ice Age megafauna on the scale we see in modern livestock. Direct evidence is frustratingly scarce. Disease rarely fossilizes. Viruses, parasites, and bacterial infections leave behind little for paleontologists to study directly, but indirect clues raise uncomfortable possibilities. One concern centers on the role Humans may have played in introducing new pathogens into the ecosystem. As human groups expanded, traveling across regions previously untouched by their kind, they may have carried parasites, bacteria, or viruses that local megafauna had no immunity against, much like how later contact between isolated human populations led to devastating pandemics, even without human assistance. Herd animals are always vulnerable to outbreaks of respiratory infections, gastrointestinal parasites, and insect-borne diseases. Harsh winters, nutritional stress, and overcrowding amplify these risks. Weakened animals become more susceptible. Sick individuals can transmit illness rapidly throughout the population. You watch as a young calf coughs softly near its mother, its small frame shivering slightly. In modern deer herds, conditions like lungworm infestations or viral pneumonia can sweep through populations during stressful seasons, killing off the weakest first. The same may well have happened to the Irish elk. And here lies the devastating compounding effect. Every year, already strained by shrinking grazing lands, harsher winters, and human hunting, left the herds more vulnerable to additional stressors. Disease may not have needed to wipe out entire herds overnight. It only had to weaken reproductive success, lower calf survival rates, and reduce population resilience. The more fragmented the herds became, isolated by shifting habitats and human pressure, the more vulnerable they were to genetic bottlenecks. With fewer individuals breeding genetic diversity, dropped weakening immune responses and leaving the remaining animals increasingly susceptible to disease outbreaks that once might have been manageable. You kneel by a shallow pool where muddy water swirls gently beneath melting ice. Stagnant pools like these could have served as breeding grounds for insects and parasites. During warmer seasons, small silent incubators for pathogens waiting for weakened hosts. Even more alarming are zoonotic risks, diseases capable of leaping between species. As humans domesticated dogs and wild megafauna shared overlapping territories more frequently, the potential for cross-species transmission grew. Every new interaction carried hidden dangers. While direct evidence remains limited, some scientists point toward parallels in modern conservation struggles. Today, isolated populations of endangered animals often face catastrophic population crashes when exposed to novel pathogens. Even a single virus like canine distemper or chronic wasting disease can decimate fragile herds that lack natural immunity. You glance again toward your antlered companion. His breath steams gently in the cold. His movements remain strong, deliberate. But you wonder how many calves never reached adulthood, how many breeding seasons were quietly compromised by invisible forces swirling through these shrinking herds. The beauty of the Irish elk's story lies in its complexity. No single villain bears full responsibility for their extinction. Instead, a storm of pressures gathered over centuries, climate, habitat, predators, humans, and perhaps most insidiously disease. You rise and walk forward as the herd shifts into a dense stand of frostbitten trees, the wind tugging at their flanks. They navigate carefully, following ancient paths laid down long before the threats fully emerged. But you can feel it now, the invisible weight bearing down on them from all sides. They don't know the term extinction, but they feel its approach in the emptier feeding grounds, the shrinking gene pools, the vulnerable calves, and perhaps in unseen illnesses, quietly stealing vigor from within. And still the antlers rise, wide proud, unknowing as the herd presses forward, carrying nature's most extravagant experiment further down its narrowing road. The sky above grows heavy with thick, low-hanging clouds as you continue alongside the herd, your boots crunching gently in the thinning snow. And here, as the wind hushes for a moment, you sense the growing emptiness beneath it all, the late survivors. Extinction isn't always sudden. It doesn't always come with fire flood or a dramatic final moment. Often it arrives as a long, slow dwindling, a fading presence in a world no longer built to sustain it. Even after Irish elk disappeared from most of Europe, evidence suggests that small, isolated pockets of survivors may have persisted in remnant habitats long after their prime. You pause and imagine one of these refugees, a forgotten corner of Eurasia where grasslands still cling to open spaces, where dense forests haven't fully closed in, where human hunters rarely venture. Here for a while, tiny groups of Irish elk continued ghosts of a once mighty population. Fossil finds from western Siberia and the Ural region suggest that these last holdouts may have survived thousands of years later than their western cousins, possibly as late as 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, well into the Holocene epoch, when early human agriculture was already reshaping much of Europe. Historians still argue over the exact timing. Radiocarbon dating from various sites continues to offer tantalizing but sometimes conflicting results. Was it truly the final gasp of the species, or simply scattered genetically weakened groups, hanging on a little longer in small isolated pockets? You walk along a narrow glacial ridge, now picturing one of these shrinking refuges. Fewer than a dozen animals might remain in a given area, far too few to ensure long-term survival, but enough to maintain a fleeting presence for a few generations more. Inbreeding likely grew more severe as populations shrank. With fewer individuals available for mating, genetic diversity plummeted. This would have weakened immunity, increased birth defects, and left the remaining individuals more vulnerable to disease, poor antler growth, and lowered fertility. You spot a young male ahead whose antlers curve unevenly, a silent marker of these creeping genetic struggles. In a robust population, such deformities would have been rare or quickly eliminated by natural selection. But amongst the late survivors, these flaws became increasingly common. You realize now that extinction in its final phase often feels like a slow-motion unraveling. Birth rates drop. Calves don't survive winters. Fewer healthy bulls grow antlers impressive enough to win mates. Every season brings one more layer of pressure, until finally a generation arrives that produces no offspring at all. Even the landscape mirrors this quiet collapse. The once vast mammoth steppe has now fractured into isolated valleys, wetlands, and expanding forests. Where grasses once waved for hundreds of miles now, birch saplings creep forward like quiet invaders reclaiming ground. And yet, nature allowed these last Irish elk to persist for a while. They lived long enough to watch mammoths fade from the north, long enough to coexist briefly with Neolithic humans planting early wheat and barley fields in distant settlements. Perhaps a few wandering hunters still occasionally glimpse these remaining giants from afar, isolated bulls moving across lonely hillsides, their massive antlers still catching the sun like relics of an ancient world refusing to fully surrender. You wonder whether these final herds ever sensed that they were alone, the last echoes of a once thriving lineage. Of course, animals do not understand extinction. They do not mourn lost relatives or contemplate futures. They simply survive until they can no longer. The sky darkens further as light snow drifts downward again, coating the ground in fresh layers of quiet. You can almost feel how fragile these last survivors truly were, balancing on the very edge of existence, where one harsh winter, one disease outbreak, or one poor breeding season could spell the end. And when the final Irish elk did vanish, whether from Siberia, the Urals, or some lost corner of Eurasia, they left behind no burial, no final spectacle, just silence. You glance up once more as your antlered companion moves ahead, still carrying his grand rack proudly across the narrowing land. For now, he still walks. But you know that beyond him, these last few survivors are already fading, their world closing inch by inch. And somewhere beneath your feet in the frozen earth and silent bogs, the bones of those who fell first wait quietly, the silent record keepers of a species that once defied nature's limits and for a while ruled its world. The wind grows sharper now as you walk with the herd into a wide open basin, rimmed by dark trees, pressing inward like watchful sentries. This quiet expanse, empty, exposed, and eerily still, feels almost like a stage. And indeed, for the Irish elk, this was the final act. You can feel it now, how little remains. The herd is smaller than it was when you first started your journey. Fewer calves, fewer juveniles. Even the once abundant dominant males are scarce. Their grand antlers still defiant, but now standing as monuments to a world unraveling. Extinction rarely arrives like a crashing wave. More often, it's like a slow tide, pulling back each season, stealing a little more fewer birds, harsher winters, dwindling food, rising risks. And yet, right until the very end, these giants carried themselves as they always had because they knew nothing else. You pause at the center of the basin, gazing out across the thinning snow, and realize you're standing in the kind of habitat scientists now call the extinction window. This wasn't the violent collapse we often imagine. By the time the Irish elk reached these final refuges, they had already survived thousands of years of compounding pressures. They had weathered climate shifts, dodged predators, outlasted rival species, and adapted through generations of slow, grinding change. But by this point, roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, in the early Holocene, everything had narrowed too far. The climate had stabilized into the warmer, wetter period we know today. The open steppe had given way almost entirely to expanding forests and wetlands. The great grasslands that once fed their mineral-hungry bodies were now fragmented, isolated patches among young woodlands that left little room for wide-antlered giants to navigate. And humans, no longer simple hunters, had become farmers. You picture it now, scattered Neolithic settlements, spreading across Europe and Asia, clearing land, building permanent homes, raising livestock, and reshaping the landscape in ways even woolly mammoths had never seen. The wild world of the Pleistocene was vanishing beneath fields, pastures, and villages. Historians still argue whether agriculture directly accelerated the Irish elk's final collapse. Some believe human expansion crowded the remaining herds into smaller, more vulnerable pockets of habitat. Others suggest that habitat loss had already pushed them to the brink before agriculture reached full scale. But either way, the outcome was the same: fewer places to graze, fewer safe migration corridors, fewer minerals to feed their exhausting antler growth cycles. You crouch by a streambed where the grass thins, brushing aside snow to reveal tiny crushed shells, ancient remnants of aquatic snails, once scraped from the mud by thirsty elk, desperate for calcium. In these late stages, every mineral source was precious, every morsel critical for survival. And here's the great irony, even at their weakest, the Irish elk kept trying. The young bulls still grew their antlers each spring, though often smaller and more misshapen now. The cows still bore calves, though fewer survived harsh winters. The herds still moved carefully across shrinking landscapes, following ancient instincts even as their world closed around them. This quiet, stubborn persistence is what makes extinction so cruel. Species do not understand that they are dying. They simply continue adapting as best they can until there is no room left to adapt. You follow the herd deeper into the basin where their tracks now braid together in tight circular paths, signs of animals pacing within increasingly narrow ranges. No longer wandering giants of open steppes, these late survivors have become prisoners of shrinking islands of suitable habitat. The wind carries faint sounds of other animals, birds, perhaps wild boar or distant human activity beyond the trees. The Irish elk are no longer rulers here. They are simply still here for now. You glance at your antlered companion once again, knowing that if this were truly one of those final herds, he may well be among the last of his kind. His enormous rack, while still magnificent, feels almost tragic now, an echo of a former world out of sync with the one that remains. The snow begins falling again, fine and soft, muffling the silence. You realize that when the last Irish elk finally passed, whether from hunger, age, accident, or some quiet, unnoticed death in a distant marsh, there was no witness to mark its end. No great predator claimed the final prize. No storm delivered the final blow. The last one simply failed to find a mate, or a calf failed to survive a late spring frost, or a bull grown too weak failed to regrow his antlers properly and was pushed aside by younger males who had no herd left to inherit. And in that quiet, slow unraveling, an entire species faded. You stand for a moment longer beneath the falling snow, watching the herd press on into the gray light, still walking, still searching, not knowing that their road is ending. The snowfall thickens again, a quiet shroud, pulling across the dwindling world of the Irish elk. You move beside the herd, now closer than before, almost protective of these last few members of a lineage that once numbered in the countless thousands. And here, as their final chapter approaches, you find yourself facing one of the most enduring truths of all: no extinction happens in isolation. By now, the forces that once quietly chipped away at the Irish elk's world have fully converged. No longer were they facing climate shifts, or habitat loss, or human pressure, or genetic decline. They faced all of them together, a perfect storm of slow attrition. You glance at your antlered companion. His head remains high, though you notice the strain now. Even to your eyes, the signs are beginning to show. The antlers, still white, still proud, seem a little more uneven this season. The tines not as sharp, the weight more awkwardly distributed. Such imperfections may not seem like much, but for the Irish elk, where reproductive success hinged on perfection, every asymmetry whispered that the system was breaking down. Around you, the females graze in tight formation. But there are fewer calves among them this year, a fact that's becoming harder to ignore. Fewer calves mean fewer future breeders. Fewer future breeders mean even less genetic diversity. And so the spiral accelerates. You pause beside a mineral lick, one of the few remaining sources of calcium-rich soil that these giants desperately need for antler growth. But even here you see that the ground is worn thin centuries of generations, scraping the same spot, pulling at the same fragile vein of nutrients. There's simply less left to give. Historians still argue about which pressure delivered the final blow. Some point to habitat fragmentation as the main culprit, with advancing forests cutting migration corridors into isolated patches. Others lean toward nutritional stress, where mineral shortages caused ever smaller antlers, lowering mating success until reproduction collapsed. Some believe human activity, expanding settlements, growing agriculture, relentless hunting was simply too much for these shrinking populations to withstand. And still others suggest that chance itself played a role. That once populations fell below a certain size, random misfortunes, harsh winters, poor calving seasons, minor diseases were enough to push them beyond the point of recovery. Extinction rarely comes with one clean cause. It's not a singular guillotine. It's 1,000 threads fraying slowly until one final tug unravels the whole. You glance toward the tree line, where thin pillars of human smoke still rise in the distance. Even now, long after most of their range has vanished, humans are present. No longer just hunters but farmers, builders, and reshapers of the landscape. What once was a vast, shared world has become a divided one. The remaining open fields are now broken by forests and settlements that offer no welcome for animals. With antlers too wide to fit between trees, you hear the crack of distant axes echo faintly across the frozen air. A new rhythm of the world replacing the ancient pulse of hooves across the mammoth steppe. And then perhaps the most sobering realization of all they never knew. The Irish elk lived and died with no awareness of their own extinction, no understanding that they were witnessing the closing chapters of their kind. To them, each day was as every day before. Find grass. Find minerals grow. Antlers avoid predators breed if you can survive if you're lucky. They didn't see shrinking habitats. They saw fewer places to graze. They didn't feel population collapse. They noticed smaller herds. They didn't fear extinction. They feared wolves. Extinction belongs to us, to those who look back, who run the numbers, who draw the lines between the last bones found in Irish bogs or Siberian floodplains. But to the creatures living it, extinction feels like nothing. Just another winter slightly harder than the last. The herd presses onward now as always. Heads, low hooves, crunching through the brittle snow noses, brushing aside the frosted grass for what nourishment remains. You stand still for a moment, letting them move ahead, not because you cannot follow, but because you understand now what lies ahead. Their path is narrowing, and soon there will be no more ground left to cross. But for now, in this brief sliver of time, before the last ember fades, the Irish elk still walks. The snowfall lightens again as the herd reaches the edge of a frozen marsh, a place that feels almost symbolic now. The once expansive world of the Irish elk has been reduced to these fragile pockets surrounded by forest, threatened by waterlogged ground, hemmed in by growing human footprints. And in this narrowing space, you witness something bittersweet. Nature's last echoes. The herd pauses at the marsh's edge. The dominant bull, your companion throughout this long journey, steps forward carefully, lowering his head to drink. His reflection shimmers beneath him, antlers mirrored in the thin layer of ice, like two enormous wings reaching toward nothing. You take in the scene, fully knowing that you are seeing what would become one of the final chapters in megafaunal dominance. As the Ice Age ended, these giants, mammoths, Woolly rhinos, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths disappeared one by one, leaving scattered fossils as their only testimony. The Irish elk lasted longer than many, but even it could not outrun the steady march of change. And while humans would later invent myths, artwork and legends about monsters and great horned beasts of old, few would ever truly grasp the scale of what was lost. The Irish elk became not just extinct, but almost mythical, a relic of an age before recorded history. You glance again at your towering companion. He moves with the same grace as ever, though the weight of his antlers seems a little heavier now. Perhaps it's the wind. Perhaps it's the long season. Or perhaps it's simply the weight of being one of the last. The females graze carefully behind him, but their numbers are fewer still. The calves that once bounded confidently now huddle close to their mothers, smaller, thinner, more tentative. Each surviving generation must face a slightly harder world than the one before. You step around a shallow patch of ice, where half-submerged antler fragments peek through the slush, old remains of earlier generations who once crossed this same marsh. The cycle of life struggle and quiet disappearance is etched right into the landscape. The causes, as always, remain tangled. Climate instability shrank their grasslands, robbing them of food and forcing them into less favorable terrain. Nutritional depletion weakened their ability to grow the impressive antlers that define their success. Predators and human hunters took their share, especially as populations weakened. Habitat fragmentation sliced up ancient migration routes into isolated islands of survivable space. Disease and inbreeding gnawed silently at the genetic foundation of shrinking herds. Historians still argue which factor was strongest, but perhaps that's the wrong question entirely. The story of the Irish elk was never about one overwhelming catastrophe. It was about the compounding weight of small disadvantages, slowly accumulating until nature could no longer balance the equation. You kneel near the water's edge, running your hand along a long, curved tine, sticking up from the marshy ground. The texture is rough, worn by centuries of exposure, but its shape remains unmistakable. A small echo of the antlers still towering above you. Even now, as extinction presses close, you sense no panic from the herd, no understanding of what's coming. Only the same instincts that guided them for millennia: graze, grow, mate, survive. They do not fear extinction. They cannot comprehend it. They simply continue. And that perhaps is the most haunting part. The extinction of the Irish elk didn't happen with a bang. No volcano, no asteroid, no sudden catastrophe erased them. Instead, their world became slightly less suitable every decade, until finally there were too few individuals left to continue the story. You step back now, letting the herd move ahead toward the open stretch of the marsh, knowing full well that their path is drawing to a close. The last of the Irish elk would vanish quietly, their final individuals, slipping away into history, without witnesses, without ceremony, without even knowing that they were the end. But even as they faded from the world, their legacy persisted. Their bones would be unearthed centuries later by puzzled farmers. Their antlers would hang in royal halls and natural history museums. Their silhouettes would adorn ancient cave walls and modern textbooks. Their story, a mixture of grandeur, fragility, and tragic beauty, would echo long after their final steps. The wind rises softly again, catching the broad sweep of your companion's antlers as he leads the herd across the thinning ice, still upright, still magnificent. And for one last moment, the Irish elk remains. The final traces of sunlight vanish behind the treetops as the herd moves deeper into the marshland. You follow silently now, careful not to disturb this fragile procession. In the fading light, every breath they release rises like faint ghosts into the frozen air, their presence growing quieter, their world thinner with every step. Here, in these last scattered refugees, the Irish elk reaches its end. There is no final predator waiting, no great battle, no sudden disaster. Only this narrowing strip of survivable land and the steady erosion of possibility. This is not extinction as drama, it is extinction as erosion. You watch your antlered companion, once part of a mighty lineage that ranged across continents, pick carefully across the soft, uncertain ground. Even now, the instincts that guided his ancestors are unchanged. Seek grass, seek minerals, avoid danger, grow antlers, find mates. But here, in this quiet place, there are no more mates waiting. The herd has shrunk too far. The gene pool has thinned beyond recovery. What once was a symphony of vast herds, elaborate displays and thunderous mating contests, has faded into a mere whisper. The few calves that remain are thin. The dominant bulls are tired, their once symmetrical antlers showing signs of asymmetry, brittle tips, and uneven beams. The land itself seems to mirror their decline. Grasses are patchy mineral sites, nearly depleted forests creeping closer year by year. Historians still debate how long these final survivors lingered. Did they vanish entirely by 7,000 years ago? Or did isolated remnants persist even longer, scattered through hidden valleys or remote bogs where no hunter's spear ever reached? We may never know, but here you see the broader truth. They were not defeated by a single cause. They were undone by the weight of many small losses, each survivable in isolation, but together fatal. The final winters were just a little harsher, the calves just a little fewer, the antlers just a little smaller. You stop and kneel one last time beside a patch of exposed peat where old bones lie half buried beneath moss and frozen soil. The curve of an ancient antler gleams faintly in the moonlight, a perfect echo of the living form that still stands before you. It is a strange, haunting beauty to witness. Both the living and the fossil together, the last breaths of a species that carried grandeur too large for the world that remained. The herd pauses ahead as snow begins falling again, gentle flakes spiraling down like the quietest farewell. You realize that when the very last Irish elk finally died, whether by age, accident, or simple failure to find a mate, there was no audience, no record, no monument. The world simply shifted forward, and life continued without them. But their legacy never vanished. Today, you see it in towering antlers displayed in museums, in the puzzled awe of visitors craning their necks to comprehend their size. You see it in ancient cave art, where white antlers sprawl across torchlit walls, proof that humans once stood face to face with these giants. You see it in the research, the books, the debates, scientists still piecing together their long, complicated fall. And you see it in this journey. You've taken a quiet walk through the echoes of a vanished world where giants once ruled, and where for a little while longer they still walk beside you. The wind grows softer now. The herd moves on shadows, merging into the gray mist ahead. And with one final glance at your towering companion, you let them fade into the snowfall, proud, magnificent, and gone.